TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @Afra_. Torrin Dane. I watched Nareni go, a complicated mix of feelings settling in me. From what I could gather, Carcian knew about Bloodjone's drug mixing operations and had for some time. The fact that he was taking steps without Nareni's knowledge, and utilizing Wade's help, must have felt like a massive betrayal. She was supposed to be his second in command, after all. I looked at the rat up and down, a new understanding finally clicking into place in my mind, like the final piece of a complicated puzzle. The picture it formed was now crystal clear, obvious with the last little segment. So that's why you recruited me, I said wonderingly. You wanted a weapon to point at Bloodjone, a knife with which to sever the corruption from the healthy flesh. Not a thief, a warrior. It made sense. If Carcian had been making plans and gathering information against Bloodjone in this operation for the past few months, then bringing me on, a mage who had a blood vendetta against them, was a wise choice. I felt a bit of anger at that. I wasn't just a weapon to be pointed at something Carcian wanted destroyed, a tool of his machinations. Another part of me felt resignation. I had signed up for this, knowing the man had deeper motives. And even better, those motives matched my own. I knew mages were weapons, regardless of what they wanted. Carcian narrowed his attention on me, his stance more rigid than before. The conversation with Nareni had affected him, but I didn't know the man well enough to tell how. No, not sever corruption from healthy flesh, Torrin, he said, more bite in his tone than he used with his protege. Bloodjone isn't a wound that can just be excised. They are a limb that needs amputation. You were a surgeon's assistant once, weren't you? You understand this. The bitterness in his voice surprised me. It was something I recognized well, an anger that resonated deep within. Bloodjone had hurt Carcian somehow. The look in his eyes was personal. Before I could latch onto that familiarity, the storm dampened, then vanished back into Carson's relaxed posture. He seemed to shed the effects of the conversation, his confident and guile-filled air returning like water filling in a breach. But that doesn't matter to you, does it, Torrin? You'll get what you want sooner or later. A pause. Congratulations on your first heist, by the way. I hope you made a good impression on any who saw you. I nodded. Thanks, I said, even more unsure about the man in front of me than ever before. Carcian waved at me with a dismissive hand. I'll call you back here shortly. There's something I want to talk to you about later. Understanding the dismissal, I shuffled to leave, catching the look on Hoffel's face before I went to my room. He looked sad, a mournful look stretched across his features. He seemed far older with that expression. It was something about how his wrinkles deepened, and shadows coated his brow. Thank you for helping me back there, I whispered under my breath. I don't know what I might have done if you hadn't stopped me. Lady Dawn hovered at my side, the familiar darkening of shades and colors beckoning her arrival. Your actions were wiser than they may have been, contractor, she said, sending a glance behind me to Carcian. I have another note of advice if you are inclined to take it. Her arms were folded neatly over her stomach, the picture of poise. When Nareni had told me about what Bloodjone was doing, a familiar anger swallowed my thoughts. It wasn't just me that the blood was hurting, but every broken addict in East Theatra. I knew what drugs could do to a person, how addiction broke them down. In my previous life, I knew where the people who enabled such things peddled their wares or wrote false prescriptions. But in that life, I didn't have the power to burn a warehouse to the ground or bring such false men to justice. I couldn't send their supplies to the sky in an explosion of mana and energy. But in Alakria, I could make that warehouse burn. Lady Dawn had intervened, citing the risks of such an act. There were people inside, who might be blind to what was being sold. Burning the warehouse could spread fire to the surrounding buildings, causing it to break out of control and cause far more harm and damage than I wanted. And if I wanted to destroy the Jones, I needed to do it methodically, not in a fit of emotional rage. I'd like to hear what you have to say, I said at last, reaching my room. The cistern didn't have a particularly tall ceiling, so I always felt like the rooms were looming down on me. With the narrowed vision and dampened colors of the unseen layering over it all, that feeling was multiplied. This rat, Lady Dawn said, gliding alongside me as I moved, her phantom form glowing slightly, cannot be trusted wholeheartedly. He is a man who keeps his thoughts close to his chest, unwilling to share them with those he needs to. I doubt he will guide you your goal straightforwardly, if at all. I contemplated Lady Dawn's words for a moment, but he does have a grudge against Bloodjone, I replied, feeling conflicted. I could feel that much. The same as you did when you decided to trust me. I paused. We have the same goal, don't we? Why would he try and lead me astray? The destination of your journeys may very well be the same spot, Lady Dawn replied as we walked into my room, but the paths you tread are different. And to take the next step on his road, obstacles can easily be shifted to yours. That does not mean to abandon trust completely, merely be conscious of this man's nature. Lady Dawn looked contemplative. An alternative may be to grow closer with your other teammates, but maintain a distance with their leader. You make a good point about Carcian, I acknowledged, but what would distancing myself from him like that do to help me along? The man desires to control, Lady Dawn replied. It is his crutch and his drug. He shows it in the very nature of showmanship, in how he wishes to influence others around him and maintain information. Show him that some of that control may be slipping, that his unwillingness to trust has caused him ill rather than gain. Not too much, however, else he may try to assert his control with an iron grip. I sighed as I fell down onto my bed. It doesn't make sense, I mused, thinking back to the night before when Carcian had shown me the good he had done. The intensity in his eyes as he watched greed distribute the food felt just as real as the anger I saw today. Does he want the best for the people around here, or is it vengeance against Bloodjone? He felt genuine last night when he showed me the good the rats were doing. Lady Dawn tilted her head. Motivation is a complicated concept, contractor. This Carcian may not be driven by just one objective. He may have complementary end goals, one to see his enemies fall, and the other to see his allies prosper. But that does not detract from my earlier statement. That's an awfully insightful look into humans from an Asuran mind, I said musingly, more to myself into the phoenix. It is ingrained, Lady Dawn replied, countering my observation with what could either be obliviousness or apathy. The moment stilled, then I asked a question that had been tugging at the back of my mind for a while now. What do you do when you're not gliding over the stones in front of me? I asked. Do you just vanish into my core, or am I just not able to see you? Lady Dawn cocked her head, seemingly surprised by my question. When I appear before you, I simply choose to make myself visible to your eyes, she said, answering that question. Where before you were blind to the true workings of the world, I allow you to peer a bit deeper for a few minutes at a time, she said. I furrowed my brows, sitting up from my bed. So it was like the latter. Lady Dawn essentially put the magical equivalent of night vision goggles over my head, allowing me to detect infrared light. Wait, does that mean you can just explore on your own? Go off wherever you want for a time? The phoenix hesitated. No, I cannot move far. As I stated before, I am bound to you in more ways than one, she said evasively. Perhaps it was a bit selfish, but it felt comforting to always know that I could call for Lady Dawn. That thought immediately soured with guilt as I realized the implications of her words. I never gave it much thought before now, but Lady Dawn couldn't leave me. She was probably stuck trailing after me as a ghostly shadow, only able to be seen by a single person. She wasn't clear on the details, but it was a prison nonetheless. My mouth felt very dry. You traded one prison for another, I said guiltily, looking at the floor. It was I who initiated the offer for her to grant me power, and it seemed that I still wasn't fully aware of the implications. She escaped her capture by Agrona only to be bound to me, unable to interact with the world or speak to anybody else. This is no prison, I heard Lady Dawn say, surprisingly resolute. I have more freedom here than I enjoyed in an age. She paused. One of her dusky purple hands brushed against her forehead. And my mind is my own. My choices are my own. This is no prison. I struggled to accept her answer. Her bars might be far, far better relative to her previous conditions. But just because the injustices she faced now were minor compared to the past did not make them less injustices. But looking into her simmering eyes, I knew I wouldn't be able to change her mind. Is there anything I can do to make it better for you, at least? I asked hopefully. It must be awfully boring to just stand around all day, unable to interact with anything. The Asura contemplated this for a second. It would please me if I could have some reading material, she said slowly. I do not know what my options are, though. It has been many years since I have been allowed to enjoy a book. And so, a few minutes later I found myself in front of Wade, who looked crestfallen at the recent scuffle he had with Nareni. If I wanted a book from a library, the obvious avenue was talking to the librarian. I coughed into my fist, drawing Wade's attention. He had been stooped over the table in front of the map of Fiatra, reading over a few papers. Oh, Torin, Wade said, adjusting his glasses. The man was dressed in dark trousers and a light buttoned shirt that was looking very wrinkled. I didn't notice you there. I hope I didn't ignore you too long. I spared a glance at Wade's work. It was a smaller map, with certain buildings highlighted in light ink with notes scrawled around them. You didn't miss me, I said. Peering closer at the map in front of him, I felt a note of curiosity. What are you working on, exactly? I recognize one of the marked buildings as the one I just helped steal from. Ah, this is part of what Carcian had me working on, the young man said with a sigh, running a hand through his hair. These points are for warehouses that Bloodjohn uses to distribute their drugs, the sentry said, gesturing to a few of the dots. I don't know what Carcian was planning on doing at each of these places, but he had me tracking their locations and movements for a while now. I thought the boss man wanted you to keep quiet about that, I replied, remembering Carson's stern rebuke of his protege. There's not much of a point to that now, Wade said bitterly. Though I don't think there was a good reason in the first place. I stared at the small map. There were a surprising number of warehouses, at least 6 that he had identified. So, is acid beam paper used in the creation of Blythe? I asked, staring intently at the map. Wade identified something in my tone, causing him to take his eyes away from the paper. I think it is. Nobody really knew the origins of Blythe here in the slums, he said with a note of understanding. The drug has been called the Hive Mother's honey for the longest time, but most people didn't know the origin of that. In more recent months, I've sent my rats to the deeper parts of the Jones operations, and have discovered concrete proof of it. The secret for its creation has been hoarded closely for years. It clawed at something deep in me that all the men who died on the acid beam hornet attack did so at the whims of glorified drug lords, looking to get their next product out on the market. But I didn't let the thoughts overwhelm me. I couldn't. I shook my head, dispelling the thoughts. I actually wanted to ask you if you could get me a few books from the library, I said, changing the topic. Seeing as you're a librarian, it probably wouldn't be too hard to sneak out a few extras for me. Wade sat up straighter at this. I could do that for you, he acknowledged with a tired smile. Anything in particular you want? He asked. A few primers on monotheory, I said, stating what I wanted for myself. And are there any nonfiction reads you'd recommend for somebody who hasn't read anything in that genre at all? Wade's eyes glittered, pushing away some of the earlier melancholy. Nonfiction is a bit too broad of a category for me to pick out anything. Do you mean philosophy, language, science, history? I realized that the Phoenix's request of anything nonfiction included half of the genres of reading known to man. I felt the urge to call out to Lady Dawn and ask what she really wanted, but it was a bit late for that. Do you have anything on the stars or constellations? I hedged, taking a gamble at what the Phantom Asura might appreciate. I felt even more guilty that Lady Dawn would need to use me as an intermediary for this, as she couldn't interact with the outside world. I was like a jailer to her, as she couldn't ask Wade himself. Wade seemed to think for a moment. I can think of a few books on the cosmos. Maybe Aldoreth's Encyclopedia of Stars, then. That has a lot of old folk tales about the stars in it for somebody who wants a good story. But a catalog of constellations movement across Alacria has more data-backed information. The man looked at me. Which would you like? Both? Wade chuckled to himself. I'll see what I can get you in a few days, Torin. I felt thankful for his help on this. Thanks, Wade, I said with a smile. Don't worry about it, he countered, staring back at the papers in front of him. I've got a lot on my hands right now, though. I don't know when I'll get you those books. Are you the only one able to do the work, though? I asked, looking over the sheets he had. Can anybody help you with it? Carcian didn't want me going around with this, he replied with a bitter shrug. Though, you just gave me an idea to fix the mess I'm in, he said, a hopeful smile crossing his face. He gave me another nod as he got back to work. Laurent Joan. I was pulled from the depths of my sleep by a forceful pulse of mana at my door. It thundered outward, crashing against me and banishing my dreams to oblivion. I scrambled upward, lightning jumping to my hands as I fought against the blankets that covered my body. I was smothered by them, and I almost felt like they were trying to strangle me. I couldn't see out from them. The cloth pulled at my arms, restricting my mobility. I needed to move. The spell cloaking my fist burned the cloth around me, causing smoke to billow in the air. Once I was out from under the cloth, I forcefully buried the panic I had been feeling, calming my breathing. I was Laurent Joan. I did not feel fear from simple bed sheets. But the cool air was a welcome relief from the smothering heat from under my blankets. Who dared interrupt my sleep? I thought, ignoring my embarrassment and shame for my earlier weakness. I despise closed spaces. I'll have their head. My chambers were equipped with everything a noble blood should have. The decor was exquisite, showing the grand power that Bloodjohn wielded. One could feel how solid the furniture was just from looking at it, the hardwood polished to reflectiveness. I powered on the light artifacts above with the flick of a nearby switch, making me wince as the darkness retreated. In the reflection of my nightstand, I could see my own bloodshot eyes. And one of the utter necessities that my room held was a sword kept leaning against my bedside. I grasped it, ready to decapitate the fool who had made me shame myself. Before I could rise, however, Dorner barged into my room. He sported his usual cocky grin, his stride more fit for a prancing swifter horse than a man. Seeing his confidence made my blood boil. Had he awoken me? Explain yourself, Dorner. Tell me why you interrupted my sleep or I'll have you flogged. Dorner spared a glance toward my still smoking blankets, causing my grip on my sheathed sword to tighten. Did he know? Word just in, brother, he said cheerily. The rats robbed the Ilasian's warehouse that held our product. I thought of all the product that was stored in that warehouse, and all the profit it would make my house. The method for creating Blythe was a closely held secret amongst highbloods, but I had won it through my own ingenuity and grit a few years ago from a unique person. With the product, Bloodjohn's failing prospects had seen meteoric recovery. Where before we were the laughingstock of Fiatra, a one-trick blood who had decimated their rivals in a lucky slaughter, now those around us whispered my name in the shadows in fear. As they should. It was dangerous to create Blythe and says Clar. Scythe Ceres herself had expressed her displeasure regarding the substance openly. But where everyone else cowed to her whims, I saw a true opportunity. True profit. And the rats had stolen all of that profit from me. Lightning erupted from my hands as I struck out at my nightstand, shattering it into splinters. First they ruined the acid beam paper retrieval, making it impossible to produce more Blythe. Then they took my product for themselves. Those unblooded bastards planned to sell it themselves. I snarled, realizing their plan. If no new Blythe was entering production, demand would skyrocket while supply plummeted. Those thieves would make a profit off of my work. Thing is, brother, they didn't actually steal the Blythe. My spell fizzled out as I tried to process my brother's words. But you said the rats robbed the Ilasian's warehouse. I never said they stole our product, Dorner chided. They stole from a safe I rigged. It sent a monopulse all the way over here. I went over and checked, and sure enough, none of your product was touched. My brother grinned. So you can wipe that scowl off your face. It makes you look terribly ugly. More so than usual, at least. I hissed through gritted teeth. If they didn't steal the product from us, I don't see the point of waking me in the middle of the night. But I finally confirmed something about how the rats are getting their information. Dorner said cheekily, and with this, they'll finally succumb to us like the rodents they are. Chapter 34, Investigations. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @Afra_. Nareni. It was with mild irritation that I let Wade into my room after he knocked, watching him as he held a thick stack of papers. Normally, I might have prodded at his arm or ruffled his hair. Those provoked a reaction that I savored. Today, he had a couple of days of stubble on his chin and looked even more tired than usual, his day shift at the library keeping him awake for the rest of THNE hours. I forcibly quashed the burgeoning sympathy I felt for him. He had lied to me along with Carcian, keeping me out of an important decision. What is it? I asked briskly. Wade seemed taken aback at my tone, but continued nonetheless. I wanted to show you what I've been working on for the past few months, he said, referencing the stack of paper in his hands. He had one lock of hair out of place that I had a primal urge to fix. I quashed that too. I frowned at him. So now that the secret is out, you're going to tell me about what you were working on. When it's already done. Carcian didn't tell me I could show you this either, he replied in a clipped tone. I came here because I wanted to. We locked gazes for a moment before I relented. Regardless of my irritation, I did need to know the contents of those papers. Fine, what did you figure out? Wade's shoulders slumped as I gave him the go-ahead, some tension leaking from them. He moved over to my desk, which didn't have anything on it, and set down the heavy papers. He spread them out in a specific manner, clearly having done this before. Then he beckoned me over to look. I stood shoulder to shoulder with him, allowing me to see exactly what he was indicating. A few months ago, Carcian asked me to keep an eye out for certain pieces of information, he said, pointing to a specific paper. On it was information about a minor bloodhouse scrawled in messy handwriting, with what looked like departure and arrival times for carriages. He told me to report it to him only, and that's how it started. He'd ask about a few bloodhouses and their comings and goings. He shuffled through a few more papers, which allowed me to see the random information. After a while, though, I started to notice a pattern. On select days of the week, the heads of each of these smaller bloods would leave their estates at similar times. Wade wrinkled his nose. I have trouble tracking their carriages, unfortunately. They tend to use swifter horses to pull it along, and those things hate my rats for some reason. It's hard to get close, but I figured out what was happening anyway, he finished, a twinkle in his eye. He held a few pieces of paper in front of me, allowing me to look them over. I noticed the pattern almost immediately. They all leave at around the same times on Tuesdays, I said. And 4 houses matched that pattern to the letter. Blood Joan, Ilison, Fairiver, and Jasper all had important members of their families leave their estates within 20 minutes of each other regularly. They're meeting up, I said, coming to the logical conclusion. That was my guess too, Wade replied. But it could have been for any old get-together of lords. You know how they are, needing an excuse to spend their wealth and twiddle their thumbs. But Carcian pushed me to keep looking, so I managed to get a rat onto one of the carriages before the swift shearers were hooked up to them. I raised a brow at how smug he sounded about that. Is that really such a big deal, getting a rat onto a carriage? I asked, a bit amused. Wade gave me a suffering look over the rims of his glasses. Rats are smart, Nareni, but do you have any idea how difficult it can be to tell them to do something other than follow that person and tell me what they say as best your rodent ears can interpret? The young man shook his head. I've spent less time reading an entire book than I have trying to decipher what my familiars tell me. I rolled my eyes. I'm sure you had to be extra persuasive for your minions. Did you sacrifice any cheese to them to get them to do your bidding? Wade looked back at the paper on the desk, then back at me. I don't know, Nareni. No matter how much cheese I give you, I'm pretty sure you won't do my bidding, he replied. Maybe if he gave you enough, a traitorous voice whispered in my mind. You haven't tried, Wade, I said primly, focusing on the papers in front of us. Maybe if you give me enough food I will do what you want. Wade coughed, a flush rising on his cheeks. I suppressed a smirk at that, the predictable reaction giving me a bit of a rush. He was easy to tease, but he wouldn't let himself get sidetracked. Anyways, I got one of my rats into their meetings. And that was when I hit the jackpot. Wade shuffled out a few more pieces of paper, once again arraying them before us. Lord Ilison, Fairiver, and Jasper all spoke about the warehouses they owned with the Jones representative, and how Blythe was dropped off there periodically for the lords to sell. After a while, I was able to pinpoint where these warehouses were from context clues in the meetings. So you know where the Blythe is stored, then, I said, interest growing. All of it? Wade looked a bit defeated. Well, all the major distribution points, yeah. There are 3 warehouses, one owned by each of the Jones lackey bloods. But the distillery, where the product is actually made, I don't know where that is. Carcian didn't say so, but I think he was trying to track that down next. He had me looking at when the crates of Blythe are delivered, and my guess was he wanted to ambush one of the deliverers to learn about where he came from. Wade shrugged. I haven't heard back about that. I looked at the papers in front of me. A dozen different ideas popped into my head, all involving lots of destruction and warehouses burning to the ground. But as Carcian no doubt realized, it would be pointless if we didn't cut off the source of the drugs. I considered what I knew here. Then I perked up. Carcian had asked very specifically for the papers inside the warehouse's safe. Maybe. I shifted around in my dimension rune, searching for the contents of the warehouse's safe I had ransacked a couple of nights ago. Quickly finding what I needed, I withdrew the stack of papers. Do you think this has the info you need to track down the distillery? I asked, suppressing a smile. Wade scanned over the parchments. The sentry looked at each slip of paper methodically, his face visibly brightened with each word. Nareni, this is exactly what I needed, he exclaimed, shuffling through each paper. Combining his disheveled appearance, 2-day beard, and off-kilter glasses, he almost looked a bit maddened. The Ilasons must have expected some sort of sly maneuvering from the Jones. It lists specifically from where they got the shipment. This must have been their insurance against any betrayal from the Jones. I finally let my smile spread across my face. You're off my shit list for now, Wade, I finally said. I live to serve, the sentry said slyly, still shuffling through the new papers. I bumped his shoulder with my own. Tell me about these things next time, got it? Or else no amount of cheese will make me forgive you. Wade just laughed. I did make sure to fix that one errant lock of hair he had. Nareni. It was with mild irritation that I let Wade into my room after he knocked, watching him as he held a thick stack of papers. Normally, I might have prodded at his arm or ruffled his hair. Those provoked a reaction that I savored. Today, he had a couple of days of stubble on his chin and looked even more tired than usual, his day shift at the library keeping him awake for the rest of THNE hours. I forcibly quashed the burgeoning sympathy I felt for him. He had lied to me along with Carcian, keeping me out of an important decision. What is it? I asked briskly. Wade seemed taken aback at my tone, but continued nonetheless. I wanted to show you what I've been working on for the past few months, he said, referencing the stack of paper in his hands. He had one lock of hair out of place that I had a primal urge to fix. I quashed that too. I frowned at him. So now that the secret is out, you're going to tell me about what you were working on. When it's already done. Carcian didn't tell me I could show you this either, he replied in a clipped tone. I came here because I wanted to. We locked gazes for a moment before I relented. Regardless of my irritation, I did need to know the contents of those papers. Fine, what did you figure out? Wade's shoulders slumped as I gave him the go-ahead, some tension leaking from them. He moved over to my desk, which didn't have anything on it, and set down the heavy papers. He spread them out in a specific manner, clearly having done this before. Then he beckoned me over to look. I stood shoulder to shoulder with him, allowing me to see exactly what he was indicating. A few months ago, Carcian asked me to keep an eye out for certain pieces of information, he said, pointing to a specific paper. On it was information about a minor bloodhouse scrawled in messy handwriting, with what looked like departure and arrival times for carriages. He told me to report it to him only, and that's how it started. He'd ask about a few bloodhouses and their comings and goings. He shuffled through a few more papers, which allowed me to see the random information. After a while, though, I started to notice a pattern. On select days of the week, the heads of each of these smaller bloods would leave their estates at similar times. Wade wrinkled his nose. I have trouble tracking their carriages, unfortunately. They tend to use swifter horses to pull it along, and those things hate my rats for some reason. It's hard to get close, but I figured out what was happening anyway, he finished, a twinkle in his eye. He held a few pieces of paper in front of me, allowing me to look them over. I noticed the pattern almost immediately. They all leave at around the same times on Tuesdays, I said. And 4 houses matched that pattern to the letter. Blood Joan, Ilison, Fairiver, and Jasper all had important members of their families leave their estates within 20 minutes of each other regularly. They're meeting up, I said, coming to the logical conclusion. That was my guess too, Wade replied. But it could have been for any old get-together of lords. You know how they are, needing an excuse to spend their wealth and twiddle their thumbs. But Carcian pushed me to keep looking, so I managed to get a rat onto one of the carriages before the swift shoers were hooked up to them. I raised a brow at how smug he sounded about that. Is that really such a big deal, getting a rat onto a carriage? I asked, a bit amused. Wade gave me a suffering look over the rims of his glasses. Rats are smart, Nereni, but do you have any idea how difficult it can be to tell them to do something other than follow that person and tell me what they say as best your rodent ears can interpret? The young man shook his head. I've spent less time reading an entire book than I have trying to decipher what my familiars tell me. I rolled my eyes. I'm sure you had to be extra persuasive for your minions. Did you sacrifice any cheese to them to get them to do your bidding? Wade looked back at the paper on the desk, then back at me. I don't know, Nereni. No matter how much cheese I give you, I'm pretty sure you won't do my bidding, he replied. Maybe if he gave you enough, a traitorous voice whispered in my mind. You haven't tried, Wade, I said primly, focusing on the papers in front of us. Maybe if you give me enough food I will do what you want. Wade coughed, a flush rising on his cheeks. I suppressed a smirk at that, the predictable reaction giving me a bit of a rush. He was easy to tease, but he wouldn't let himself get sidetracked. Anyways, I got one of my rats into their meetings. And that was when I hit the jackpot. Wade shuffled out a few more pieces of paper, once again arraying them before us. Lord Ilison, Fairiver, and Jasper all spoke about the warehouses they owned with the Jones representative, and how blood was dropped off there periodically for the lords to sell. After a while, I was able to pinpoint where these warehouses were from context clues in the meetings. So you know where the blood is stored, then, I said, interest growing. All of it? Wade looked a bit defeated. Well, all the major distribution points, yeah. There are 3 warehouses, one owned by each of the Jones lackey bloods. But the distillery, where the product is actually made, I don't know where that is. Carcian didn't say so, but I think he was trying to track that down next. He had me looking at when the crates of blood are delivered, and my guess was he wanted to ambush one of the deliverers to learn about where he came from. Wade shrugged. I haven't heard back about that. I looked at the papers in front of me. A dozen different ideas popped into my head, all involving lots of destruction and warehouses burning to the ground. But as Carcian no doubt realized, it would be pointless if we didn't cut off the source of the drugs. I considered what I knew here. Then I perked up. Carcian had asked very specifically for the papers inside the warehouse's safe. Maybe. I shifted around in my dimension rune, searching for the contents of the warehouse's safe I had ransacked a couple of nights ago. Quickly finding what I needed, I withdrew the stack of papers. Do you think this has the info you need to track down the distillery? I asked, suppressing a smile. Wade scanned over the parchments. The sentry looked at each slip of paper methodically, his face visibly brightened with each word. Nereni, this is exactly what I needed, he exclaimed, shuffling through each paper. Combining his disheveled appearance, 2-day beard, and off-kilter glasses, he almost looked a bit maddened. The Ilasons must have expected some sort of sly maneuvering from the Jones. It lists specifically from where they got the shipment. This must have been their insurance against any betrayal from the Jones. I finally let my smile spread across my face. You're off my shit list for now, Wade, I finally said. I live to serve, the sentry said slyly, still shuffling through the new papers. I bumped his shoulder with my own. Tell me about these things next time, got it? Or else no amount of cheese will make me forgive you. Wade just laughed. I did make sure to fix that one errant lock of hair he had. Torn Dane. I was watching Greed from a rooftop, my rat's mask on and my hood up. I had taken it upon myself to deliver the woman a few loaves of bread using money out of my pocket. She slowly pulled her wagon out into the street, laden with pots and food. It had snowed again yesterday, blanketing the world in a coat of white. My breath misted on the air, blowing out from under my mask. It was the last week of November, and the temperature took a bite out of each and every underdressed man. The little hand-pulled wagon left small wheel tracks in the snow as it rattled on, the crunch of snow beneath great cheese boots determined and sure. Slowly, men and women began to pull themselves from their surroundings. One grizzled old man hauled himself up from where he'd been curled in the fetal position, shivering all the while. I spotted another woman stumbling in the snow, struggling to keep up with the slow-moving wagon. A young boy, who I could see was missing a few fingers, clung to the woman's thin skirt. He was skin and bones, and I felt my throat constrict at the sight. These have been your first times in the slums, haven't they? A voice asked from behind me. Is it that obvious? I replied, wanting to look away from the young boy, but unable to pry my gaze away. You stare at them, Nereni answered, moving up beside me. Wade was a step behind, rubbing his arms against the cold. That makes it obvious. She paused. That kid down there had frostbite a few years ago. You can tell when they lose fingers when they're young. The hand grows weirdly. Why is it like this here? I asked. I get that some people are destitute. I know not all people are born into wealthy households, but there must be thousands of people in East Fiatra. It's as large as West Fiatra. How could the city be so blind to this suffering? They're not mages, so they're left to rot, Wade answered with an agitated huff. The Bloods ignore them, leaving them all here to wallow in their own filth. That's why they have a wall between here and North Fiatra. I still couldn't understand it. I had grown up my entire life on the outskirts of this epidemic of poverty, and I hadn't even noticed. I asked another question, but there must be jobs for these people, I said. There are roads to build, artifacts to maintain, and even manual labor to carry out. I haven't seen any of these people outside this part of East Fiatra. Wade turned a critical eye toward me. For every one mage, there are 4 unadorned, he started, a bite in his words. But when one mage can do the work of 4 people on his own, 10, 20, why hire a lowly unblooded unad? Mages get the jobs on principle, leaving these people to carve out a living alone. The last part of his statement was said with subtle anger, and there's no point leaving the slums. At most stores in Fiatra, you need to prove you're a mage to buy anything. Even food. My mind flashed back to when I bought my dagger, when the attendant had me filter mana into her artifact to unlock the display case. And then again when I was checking out a book at the West Fiatra library, where I had to imbue the crystal with mana to create my library card. Ultimately, I didn't want to accept that such horrible living conditions were right next door. I watched as the boy with missing fingers tripped in the snow, tumbling into it in a puff of white. His mother hastily pulled him out, brushing his limbs free of white powder frantically. I'm sorry for biting your head off, Wade said as the silence lingered. My family still lives here. I got out when I got my mark, but my sister and my mother? They're still here, toiling through it all. I thought of what to say. I'm sorry, I eventually said, knowing it wasn't enough. I thought of Norgan in the place of that young frostbitten child. I cared for my brother, too. I wouldn't have wanted him here, especially away from me. Wade kicked at the snow in front of him, causing a puff of white to spray in the air. They're doing better, now that I'm able to provide a bit for them. But the streets are still dangerous for anyone who can't defend themselves, especially unadorned women. That's why I joined the rats. I'm making East Fiatra safer, bit by bit. A nobler goal than mine, I acknowledged. My quest was fueled by righteous vengeance, but it was revenge at its core. Not nearly as pure as the simple desire to protect those you loved. Nareni scoffed. The Jones have what you're bringing them coming, she affirmed, fixing her dark cloak in place. They're half the reason it's so bad down here. Getting hooked on Blythe breaks you inside. She shivered, and not from the cold. The silence continued for a second longer before the young rat broke it. Come on, you two. You've got to stop moping about. She peered at Greed, who had reached the edge of the canal and was slowly setting up for the community cookfire. I've got an idea that'll cheer you both up. What would that be? I asked, a bit curious. She smirked under her mask, pointing to where a thin man was hauling firewood over to the pots. Don't you think that'd be fun? I think we could help. Wade wiped the fog away from his glasses with his cloak, then leaned forward, trying to get a better view. I'm not sure hauling logs would be fun, he muttered. Nareni swatted him. I meant joining in on the festivities. After we help them set up, of course. I frowned. I can't go down there in the open. The Jones put a kill order out on me, remember? All their lackeys want to stick a knife in my belly. Nareni hesitated, but it was surprisingly Wade who piped up. Just for a little bit, then. If you're in and out before anyone can report you, you'd be fine. Just for one night? I wavered, thinking up reasons I couldn't go down there. If somebody recognizes me there, won't it draw attention to Greed? Hurt her somehow? All those people down there showed up randomly for the food, Nareni countered. Why would they guess that you're directly associated with that woman? Well, I was directly associated with Greed, but Nareni had a point that the automatic assumption of any spies wouldn't be that I helped set this little cookfire up, but that I was getting free food. I couldn't think of any more arguments off the top of my head, and Nareni knew it. She smiled, then pulled off her mask. She withdrew her cloak and mask into her dimension ring, then pulled out a few thicker, more worn coats. She tossed one to me, which I caught in surprise. It was brown and patchy, with a few tears across the ends, but was in one piece. The smell, however, caught me off guard. You've got to fit in with the pack, Nareni chirped, tossing the other coat to Wade, who barely caught it. So now you have to dress like a hobo. I sighed. I was watching Greed from a rooftop, my rat's mask on and my hood up. I had taken it upon myself to deliver the woman a few loaves of bread using money out of my pocket. She slowly pulled her wagon out into the street, laden with pots and food. It had snowed again yesterday, blanketing the world in a coat of white. My breath misted on the air, blowing out from under my mask. It was the last week of November, and the temperature took a bite out of each and every underdressed man. The little hand-pulled wagon left small wheel tracks in the snow as it rattled on. The crunch of snow beneath Grache's boots determined inshore. Slowly, men and women began to pull themselves from their surroundings. One grizzled old man hauled himself up from where he'd been curled in the fetal position, shivering all the while. I spotted another woman stumbling in the snow, struggling to keep up with the slow-moving wagon. A young boy, who I could see was missing a few fingers, clung to the woman's thin skirt. He was skin and bones, and I felt my throat constrict at the sight. These have been your first times in the slums, haven't they? A voice asked from behind me. Is it that obvious? I replied, wanting to look away from the young boy, but unable to pry my gaze away. You stare at them, Nareni answered, moving up beside me. Wade was a step behind, rubbing his arms against the cold. That makes it obvious. She paused. That kid down there had frostbite a few years ago. You can tell when they lose fingers when they're young. The hand grows weirdly. Why is it like this here? I asked. I get that some people are destitute. I know not all people are born into wealthy households, but there must be thousands of people in East Fiatra. It's as large as West Fiatra. How could the city be so blind to this suffering? They're not mages, so they're left to rot, Wade answered with an agitated huff. The Bloods ignore them, leaving them all here to wallow in their own filth. That's why they have a wall between here and North Fiatra. I still couldn't understand it. I had grown up my entire life on the outskirts of this epidemic of poverty, and I hadn't even noticed. I asked another question, but there must be jobs for these people, I said. There are roads to build, artifacts to maintain, and even manual labor to carry out. I haven't seen any of these people outside this part of East Fiatra. Wade turned a critical eye toward me. For every one mage, there are 4 unadorned, he started, a bite in his words. But when one mage can do the work of 4 people on his own, 10, 20, why hire a lowly unblooded unad? Mages get the jobs on principle, leaving these people to carve out a living alone. The last part of his statement was said with subtle anger, and there's no point leaving the slums. At most stores in Fiatra, you need to prove you're a mage to buy anything. Even food. My mind flashed back to when I bought my dagger, when the attendant had me filter mana into her artifact to unlock the display case. And then again when I was checking out a book at the West Fiatra library, where I had to imbue the crystal with mana to create my library card. Ultimately, I didn't want to accept that such horrible living conditions were right next door. I watched as the boy with missing fingers tripped in the snow, tumbling into it in a puff of white. His mother hastily pulled him out, brushing his limbs free of white powder frantically. I'm sorry for biting your head off, Wade said as the silence lingered. My family still lives here. I got out when I got my mark, but my sister and my mother? They're still here, toiling through it all. I thought of what to say. I'm sorry, I eventually said, knowing it wasn't enough. I thought of Norgan in the place of that young frostbitten child. I cared for my brother, too. I wouldn't have wanted him here, especially away from me. Wade kicked at the snow in front of him, causing a puff of white to spray in the air. They're doing better, now that I'm able to provide a bit for them. But the streets are still dangerous for anyone who can't defend themselves, especially unadorned women. That's why I joined the rats. I'm making East Fiatra safer, bit by bit. A nobler goal than mine, I acknowledged. My quest was fueled by righteous vengeance, but it was revenge at its core. Not nearly as pure as the simple desire to protect those you loved. Nareni scoffed. The Jones have what you're bringing them coming, she affirmed, fixing her dark cloak in place. They're half the reason it's so bad down here. Getting hooked on Blythe breaks you inside. She shivered, and not from the cold. The silence continued for a second longer before the young rat broke it. Come on, you two. You've got to stop moping about. She peered at Greed, who had reached the edge of the canal and was slowly setting up for the community cookfire. I've got an idea that'll cheer you both up. What would that be? I asked, a bit curious. She smirked under her mask, pointing to where a thin man was hauling firewood over to the pots. Don't you think that'd be fun? I think we could help. Wade wiped the fog away from his glasses with his cloak, then leaned forward, trying to get a better view. I'm not sure hauling logs would be fun, he muttered. Nareni swatted him. I meant joining in on the festivities. After we help them set up, of course. I frowned. I can't go down there in the open. The Jones put a kill order out on me, remember? All their lackeys want to stick a knife in my belly. Nareni hesitated, but it was surprisingly Wade who piped up. Just for a little bit, then. If you're in and out before anyone can report you, you'd be fine. Just for one night? I wavered, thinking up reasons I couldn't go down there. If somebody recognizes me there, won't it draw attention to Greed? Hurt her somehow? All those people down there showed up randomly for the food, Nareni countered. Why would they guess that you're directly associated with that woman? Well, I was directly associated with Greed, but Nareni had a point that the automatic assumption of any spies wouldn't be that I helped set this little cookfire up, but that I was getting free food. I couldn't think of any more arguments off the top of my head, and Nareni knew it. She smiled, then pulled off her mask. She withdrew her cloak and mask into her dimension ring, then pulled out a few thicker, more worn coats. She tossed one to me, which I caught in surprise. It was brown and patchy, with a few tears across the ends, but was in one piece. The smell, however, caught me off guard. You've got to fit in with the pack, Nareni chirped, tossing the other coat to Wade, who barely caught it. So now you have to dress like a hobo. I sighed. Chapter 35, Community. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrendane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Elecria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Elecria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. I carefully set down the chopped log, angling it so that way it formed a small pyramid with the others. A bit of dry kindling was loosely spread underneath, the tinder serving as a place to first light the fire. Covertly looking around, I made sure nobody was paying too much attention to me. Then, with a flare of my mana, I flicked a single ember into the dry leaves and twigs. My spell expanded outward slightly, the little ember embracing its new fuel. Slowly, the fire caught, licking at the larger logs. I leaned back, satisfied with my work. I was wearing the hobo coat, as Nareni had dubbed it, and dirtied my hair slightly to obscure its bright color. My strawberry blonde locks stood out in the lifeless alleys of East Fiatra, after all. I smiled at an older man who hobbled up, a pot full of water in his hands. I offered to take it from him, considering he looked to be barely holding on, but he waved me away. The man endured longer than I expected, and soon the pot was affixed on a thin metal rod, which let it hang over the fire. Now all that was left was to wait for the water to boil and then the stew could be made. I spied out of the corner of my eye a few thick bones in great cheese wagon, which would no doubt be used to make hearty bone broth. A few others chipped in miscellaneous herbs and ingredients, and soon enough a few people were rushing to set up another cooking pot. After all, there were more than enough ingredients for a single pot. Wade lingered near the edge of the gathering, watching with a look I couldn't decipher. He was bundled up in a similar coat as me, though I thought he stood out despite the attempt at disguising himself as a hobo. I meandered past a few men, who were unnervingly thin from starvation. But the gleam in their eyes as they prepared for this community powwow seemed to provide them with the strength a healthy body would. They were setting up short benches out of wood in a circle around the cook fires, using their scrawny arms to haul them about. Greed was listening to Nareni telling an animated story, the mousy brown-haired lady nodding along with a smile as the young woman regaled her with some feat. There was a slightly pinched look in the older woman's eyes, though. Oh, Nareni, you know you shouldn't be running about, messing with the bloods, Greed said. It's only a matter of time before they try and find you here, girl. It's too dangerous for you. It told you that all the time when you were little. Nareni sniffed, her upbeat air from her story simmering away. The bloods look down on us, auntie. That's why you all don't get to eat all the time, and why we have to help. And besides, they haven't caught me yet. I'm fast and good at what I do. Greed sighed, going back to stirring the pot that was just beginning to boil. Oh, you know what I mean, girl. They'll get you one day, and I don't want to be the one to see them carting in your... The woman choked off her words as she noticed me approaching. I winced, easily guessing what she was about to say. Carting in your corpse, I finished for her in my head. Like Morgan's. Oh, Torin, it's good to see you again so soon, she greeted, a mask of cheer wiping away her earlier annoyance. Carson certainly introduced you to Nareni, she said, gesturing to the person who had brought me here in the first place. We know each other, I said with a smile. We had purposefully entered the gathering at different places to make it look like we were separate. How have you been doing these past few days? Are you holding up in the snow? Oh, it's nothing I haven't faced before, the woman said, dropping some sort of spice into the boiling brew. As long as I've got some good, hot food, the chill will never get into my bones. Greed hefted a spoon, sampling a bit of the broth. It was a deep brown color, and the smell wafting off was rich and hearty. It smelled of vegetables and meat, and I suddenly remembered I hadn't had dinner yet. The Nareni must have noticed the look in my eye. Auntie's been making this stew for decades now, and it's only gotten better as time's worn on. You'll leave here with a full belly. Greed smiled demurely, waving off Nareni's compliments. Auntie, I asked with a raised brow. How long have you two known each other? I asked. I raised the girl from when she was little, Greed answered. Picked her up off the streets. She's grown into a remarkable young woman, even if she lacks my common sense. Nareni blushed. I tried to sneak into her home a decade ago, only managed to get caught in the window. When she found me, she thought I was deserving of a good meal instead of a spanking. The rest is history. And I haven't looked back since, Greed said proudly, tapping the ladle against the rim of her pot. A different cook was shuffling ingredients into the other cookpot, mixing them with precision for all. The conversation continued in a lighthearted manner for some time as the stew settled, finally mixing to fruition. All around me, the hustle and bustle increased. Men and women were starting to talk and banter loudly, the raucous noise accompanied by the wafting smell of stew. A few of them pulled out what I recognized as makeshift drums and began to tap out a tune and sing, an upbeat song I didn't recognize. Wade wandered over a second later, humming softly. Finally decided to join us? Nareni asked, breaking off from sipping the stew to test its taste. It's about time, Wade. Come on, try the stew. Most people have to wait in line, but I'm sure I can get you a bowl first. The young striker latched onto Wade's arm, hauling him to the pot. He looked very flummoxed by being dragged around by his crush, but he hid it well. I shot him a smirk and an exaggerated waggle of my eyebrows, which succeeded in making him flip me off. Before Wade could be introduced to the soup, the short guild receptionist blocked their path. You'll be waiting your turn, girl, just like the rest of them. I let you sample, not let your friends cut in line. Nareni gave a very close approximation to puppy eyes, but Greed didn't waver. The little woman was as stern as any castle guard. Nareni was banished to the back of an already forming line, several of the patrons sending good-hearted jeers their way as they went to the back. Only at the end did the black-haired striker release Wade's arm with a huff. I had been smart, in my own humble opinion. I got into line just after the first couple of people had shuffled over. Soon enough, my turn to get a serving of stew came. A stack of wooden bowls sat beside the pot, and Greed dutifully scooped a portion of the piping hot stew into one, before handing it to me with a smile as warm as the food I now held. I smiled back, then meandered to join the men who were singing in a line. I listened to the lyrics as they sang in tune with their hand drums. It was a small ballad about a pirate queen named Yorna who had ravaged the Vritra's Mossy generations ago. It told of amazing magical exploits, wrangling mana beasts on the high seas, and devious captures of wealthy blooded ships. According to the lyrics, the pirate queen had come from humble origins, and unadorned from the city of Rosaire, and had managed to wrangle her way to the top with only her wits and skill. It ended on a more somber note after a dedicated fleet sent by the High Bloods of Adelgard had cornered Yorna's ships. She fought a desperate last stand, every bit of her treasure sinking into the sea. I sipped my stew carefully lest the steaming liquid burn my tongue and thought about the story. If it had any grain of truth to it at all, it was probably heavily embellished, but there was something fascinating about the story. A non-mage pirate queen, fighting against the structure and rising above. That was inspiring and must be even more so for all those here who were stuck at the bottom. The tone of the gathering changed when a man stood up on his stool, declaring very loudly that everyone was to dance. While a few of the people around were hesitant, more and more took up the call as people went back to the drums. And as I was nearby, I wasn't able to escape being drawn in. I stumbled over my feet as the percussive music rose in volume, people's laughing voices echoing around the fires. I hastily set down my stew, vowing I would come back to it later before I was suddenly pulled into the mash of people. The people were doing some sort of folk dance I didn't recognize, but I got the movement down soon enough. I felt a wide smile spread across my face as I got into the rhythm, tapping my feet in time with the drums. I ended up holding hands with two people on either side of me, marching in lockstep to the beat. A tall bearded man pulled me along on one side, while an older woman kept me in line from another. As the music built, I restrained the urge to laugh aloud, the free-spirited nature of this something I hadn't felt since I had arrived in this world. Thump, thump, stomp, thump, thump, stomp, thump, thump, stomp. We all slowly turned in a circle around the central fire pit, kicking our legs out and away every now and then in a specific tune. I danced through one song, feeling a genuine smile stretch over my face as I whirled. I noticed Wade and Nureni holding hands as they, too, were spun about. I nodded to my friend, bouncing to the beat. He didn't seem to notice, too wrapped up in the eyes of his Nureni. The young striker was much the same, seeming to find something very interesting in those lashes of his. But as we made a full rotation around the middle, I had to extricate myself. I kicked up a bit of snow as I spun myself out of the group, going for my stew. As much as I enjoyed the dancing, my food was going to go cold, and the party would be waiting after I finished my food. My thoughts were interrupted as Greed saddled up near me, a familiar case in her arms. She had finished her rounds of distributing soup, apparently. The older woman smiled as the men cheered in expectation, a couple of the drums quieting. With a shy smile, the woman unlatched the case, revealing her loot. It was an old thing, and the varnish had worn away years ago. The edges had notable marks from where it had been held for hours. But despite all of this, it was clearly well cared for. The strings were changed regularly whenever they wore out. My mind started automatically piecing together different songs I could play, my fingers almost unconsciously cycling through some of the chords. I could play the lute very well, or Torin could. Torin was a talented musician, able to repeat a rhythm after only hearing it once. As Greed began to play a slower melody accompanied by her sweet voice, I was brought back to years past. I remembered entering the Healers Guild a long time ago, my violin's case firmly in my grip. I practiced in the early morning before my shifts, sitting cross-legged in a corner of the lobby and going over vibrato, trying to reliably create the pulsating rhythm I wanted. If my fingers only shook when I told them to, they wouldn't waver when I held a surgeon's tools. The scalpel would not slip from my fingers. On that particular day, Greed had been working the front desk as usual. But what was very unusual about that day was that she had packed her own instrument. She removed herself from her chair and sat down across from me, hefting a worn lute in her hands. I remember being very taken aback, descending from the fugue state I entered when practicing music. But I needn't have worried. The older woman demonstrated a mirror of the technique I was attempting on her lute, and then helped me correct the angle of my wrist. And as the year continued, whenever I needed a bit of help, the woman always lent a helping hand. My initial teacher for the violin was the old Dane steward, Arlen. But he had died years before, leaving my knowledge and expertise incomplete. Without Grace's guidance, I wouldn't have been able to reach the mastery I had. I drifted back to the present as Greed finished her song, the final pluck note signaling the end. I smiled slightly, clapping along with the rest of the men who had left the dancing circle. I noticed Nureni and Wade together near the edge, their hands still clasped together after their dance. Greed turned to me, a look I couldn't decipher on her face. She held her lute in front of her, the well-worn wood reflective in the firelight. Would you like to play a song, Torin? Those words ground my happier feelings to a halt. I looked at the lute, remembering how I had abandoned named Blood Dane's old clearwood violin in the depths of my apartment. Was it still there, gathering dust? The priceless heirloom had been worth far more than gold, but I had left it behind out of simple understanding. I couldn't make music, not now, not with Norgan gone. Music, to me, was hope, and with my brother's death, I didn't have the fire I needed any longer. I couldn't do that. I didn't think I'd ever be able to play an instrument again. I swallowed heavily, my eyes on the lute. The sounds around me fell away as I stared it down, trying to think of a way to voice my thoughts. The need to do so was taken from me, however. Grace's eyes widened in alarm, staring at something behind me. That caused me to snap back to reality. The fear in her face sparked a mirrored emotion in me. She opened her mouth to scream, but I was already whirling, monopumping from my core. A knife was hurtling toward my throat, descending in a downward stab. With my heightened reflexes and speed, however, I was able to whip my hand in the way to intercept. The steel pierced my leather glove with ease, parting skin, flesh, and bone as it traveled. The point emerged from the other side, splashing me with my own hot blood. Sharp pain lanced from my hand, causing me to cry out in surprising agony. The man who had stabbed me was grinning wildly, his greenish-yellow spotted skin sallow in the night sky. He was missing more than a few teeth. Too late, my mana barrier flickered into place as the flow of energy caught up. Gritting my teeth, I brought my unharmed fist in a blow toward the man's belly, but the pain made me sloppy. My blow connected, sending the man tumbling away and clutching his gut. Unfortunately, the impact also ripped the knife from my palm, causing it to tear through my flesh on the way out. Fiery pain pulsed in time with my heartbeat from the hole in my hand as it gushed blood, but I had more to worry about. Adrenaline building, I spun on my feet again, sensing the obvious bloodlust of another attacker as he barreled past Greed, throwing her to the ground in his haste. He hefted a knife as well, raising it high with a battle cry. Though my wound was a constant source of pain, I powered through it as I sidestepped my second attacker, a large brute of a man with a pox-scarred face. Countering quickly, I snapped my leg up, nailing the man's arm with a crunch. He dropped his dagger with a scream, his elbow inverted at the joint. My knuckles ended any further sound he could make when they collided with his jaw. He crumpled in a heap, out cold and missing a few teeth. Nureni whizzed next to me an instant later, a small dagger of ice forming in her palm. She looked about warily, trying to see if there were any more attackers. Instead, the eyes of the crowd were trained on us in fear, panic growing as they backed away muttering. My hand leaked blood, a steady drip 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 staining the snow pink that seemed to echo for a mile. The pain was fading under my adrenaline, and I knew I must look wild as I scanned the people in front of me. So nice to see you here, I said to Nureni. Strange coincidence, that is. The girl ignored my quip once she realized nobody else was going to attack me, instead sparing a glance at my hand. Vritra's horns, she cursed. Torin, your hand, you need to see a healer. I could see the snow through the hole in my palm, but I could already feel mana spiraling across to patch over the wound. Also, the knife had narrowly missed the bone. My healing factor would save me here. Don't worry about me, I said. I've had worse. Check on Greed. That thug threw her to the ground, but I didn't get a look at her after. To prove my point, I withdrew a long roll of bandages from my dimension ring. After the number of times I'd nearly been disemboweled in the Clearwood Forest, I'd started carrying them around on principle. I could see the conflict warring in Narani's eyes, but eventually, her love for her foster mother wore out. She turned around, beelining for Greed, who was still on the hard ground. Torin Dane, a ragged voice called from behind me. The men and women who had gathered to dance, enjoy themselves, and rekindle the hope in their lives gasped in horror at whatever they saw behind me. Come here, let me bleed you. I turned around again, the bandages quickly forgotten. 10 feet away was the man who had stabbed a hole through my hand, standing on wobbly legs. He had reclaimed his knife. I froze still, shock rolling over me. The man wasn't aiming his blade at me. No, in front of him was the young boy missing fingers I had spied earlier. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he looked at me. I heard his mother cry out in terror behind me, the calls of my baby ringing in my ears. The thug held his blade to the shivering child's throat, a mad grin on his face. The deadly sharp weapon hadn't drawn blood, but I could see the pressure. If he pressed a little more. Surrender yourself to me, Dane, the man cried, or the kid gets it. Come on. I stood there, frozen stiff, my mind zipping through 1,000 different ideas. Unfortunately, the man didn't give me time to think. Hands in the air, Dane. Haltingly, I complied, raising my bloodied hands above my head. The crackle of the fire behind me was all that could accompany my heart, which thumped loudly in my chest. One wrong move, the man said, flexing his grip on his dagger. And I slide this knife right across this little boy's throat. Do you want that? No, I said quickly, gesturing with my hands. Just put the knife down. I'll come with. Stop moving, the hostage taker yelled, his voice raising in pitch. His greenish yellow skin morphed as he screamed, taking on a horrifying tone. His hood had been up earlier when he ambushed me, but now that it was down I could see he had patchy brown hair. No, come here. I need to drive this knife into your heart, Dane. If you do. The man licked his lips. I locked eyes with the child, trying to convey as much of my confidence as possible. You're going to be fine, I tried to say to him as I inched forward. You'll be fine, I'm going to help. Faster, the man said, causing me to shuffle forward. He wasn't giving me time to think of a plan. His eyes flicked to somebody behind me. Stay still, woman, move and I'll cut his throat, he called, repeating his threat. Nareni halted behind me. You're not going to do anything, I said calmly, drawing the insane Blitthead's attention. What do you think the Jones can do for you to attack a mage? The man was clearly a non-mage, and in combat between a mage and an unad, I would always triumph, but I had to keep his focus on me. Quiet, the man screamed, deranged in every sense of the word. You don't get to speak. Yes, I do, I said, my sense of calm returning in spades as a plan solidified. What do you think taking a child hostage will do? Just cause me to give myself up? Would you let yourself die if threatened with a boy's life? I heard the mother whimpering behind me and truly didn't know the answer regarding myself. But this thug, my words made him hesitate, his grip loosening slightly on his knife as a strange expression crossed his face. Would I let him kill me, just because of a random boy? He didn't know. Then the grunt banished whatever common sense he had, moving the knife from the boy's neck to point at me. You can't trick me, mage. The Jones promised me, they did. But that brief distraction was all that was needed to turn the tide. The thug never saw Wade sneaking up behind him, even when the rock the sentry swung impacted the back of his skull. Chapter 36, Incentive. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrendane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrendane. The thug reeled to the side, a streak of crimson blood spraying out from where Wade had clocked him. The knife he held toward me slipped from his suddenly weak fingers, falling in slow motion to the snow below. Before it could even hit the ground, I slammed the full force of my telekinesis into the earth behind me. I rocketed forward in a flare of white, the power of my push blowing a curtain of snow in my wake. I reached out with my hand, latching onto the collar of the thug's grimy tunic before he could even blink. He flailed in confusion, his head wound disorienting his balance. I wasn't about to make that any easier. I turned, using the momentum from my forward rush and a twist of my shoulder to slam the man into the ground hard. He bounced off the stone, the sickening crack of something breaking from the impact echoing into the quiet night. My firm grip on his throat shoved him back into the indent he'd made in the snow. I drew my dagger with my wounded left hand, wincing at the pain of clenching my fist around its hilt. I knelt over the downed man, one hand on his throat and another with a dagger poised over his eye. My knee locked his chest and arm firmly in place, and with my enhanced strength I knew he wasn't going anywhere. The thug gasped for breath, a wheezing, rickety sound, then groaned in pain. A speck of blood spattered from his mouth as he coughed, hacking for air. I might have damaged one of his lungs with how hard I threw this druggie into the dirt. I could have broken his spine. I didn't care. I spared a quick glance at my surroundings, unwilling to let myself be caught off guard again. Wade was ferrying the young boy over to his mother, who was completely focused on her child. Nareni was still tending to greed. Whatever the other thug had done had clearly hurt the woman somehow. That only stoked my anger higher, matching the heat of the cook fires around me. How did you find me so fast? I hissed to the man I had pinned. The man's vision cleared for a moment, but he looked at my poised dagger with a terrified expression. He whimpered underneath me, wriggling slightly before I pressed my knee harder onto his chest. Considering what I felt give way under the pressure, I knew I had broken a few of his ribs. He wailed in pain, and I immediately let off. Look, I whispered lowly, I don't need to kill you. You don't need to be in pain for too long, but you were going to tell me how you found me. I had only been visible for less than half an hour. The fact that this man attacked me so quickly told me that Bloodjohn had a better network in East Fiatra than I was led to believe. Don't kill me, man. It wasn't personal. I know what I said, but I take it back. Please. I grit my teeth, my patience wearing thin quickly. I hissed, snapping the next words. Tell me. My blade, hovering just over his eye, began to drip with blood. The wound on my hand was still leaking, and the stream had slowly meandered down my glittering steel. My blood slowly fell from the tip of my blade, dripping just under the thug's eye. I just saw you dancing around. He whimpered between gasps of pain. I could distinctly smell the stench of urine from the man, whatever motley courage he'd plucked up gone with the wind. It was an accident, they promised me. Drip, drip, drip. The blood ran down my knife, my grip quivering as I held it over his face. Does your hand shake from the pain, or making the threat? A voice inside me asked. I forcefully suppressed it, knowing I couldn't afford introspection right now. The man kept saying they'd promised him. What was he talking about? What did the Jones promise you? I said, leaning over, my breath fogged in the night air, lending a supernatural chill to my tone. They said they'd supply my fix for the rest of my life. He cried, beginning to openly weep. If I killed you, they'd give me enough blithe to drown in. I blinked, taken aback by the statement, but another matter took my attention away from the thug. I felt an urgent hand on my shoulder shaking me. Wade was there, but he wasn't looking at me. He was nervously scanning the crowd around him, which had been watching with silent fear for the last minute of interrogation. What? I snapped, angry at having the one blissful moment I had experienced in this world shattered. I remembered that dance, where I held hands with these people. It brought the closest thing I'd felt to happiness since coming to this world. My anger shifted to anxiety as I took in the people around us again. Where before they all watched with pure fear, now there was a hint of hunger in many of their eyes. They'd give me enough blithe to drown in, the man said. How many of the people surrounding me were blithe addicts, and how willing were they to attack an armed mage? I saw it there, in many of their eyes. It wasn't the hunger of a predator stalking his prey. No, this was the ravenous gleam of a man who had been starving for weeks and was ready to take desperate measures for a meal. Some of the other people were backing away, clearly recognizing danger when they saw it. A few young women were moving greed to her wagon, taking chance glances behind me. The mother with her son was among them, a worried look on her face. Nareni was still with them, but it looked like she was ready to cut her way through the people surrounding me. I slowly stood, peering around me. I could get out of this, but Wade couldn't. He had no physical enhancement runes to speak of, and I highly doubted a small mob after Blythe would be selective in their mage targets. I kicked the man below me one final time in the ribs for good measure, leaving him to groan in pain. Then I squared my shoulders, staring coolly at the men that surrounded us. Maybe around 10 people seemed interested in whatever deal the Jones offered the man whimpering at my feet. Twice that number was backing away with increased haste, showing good sense. I could take 10 non-mages. I could do that easily, but could I do it protecting Wade, without lethal force? Torrin, Wade said nervously, shuffling on his feet. Don't worry, I said quietly. We'll get out of this. I cracked my neck, then reoriented my dagger. The blood leaking from my hand was coating it now. You don't want to do this, I said, distorting my voice with sound magic. It took on an unnatural quality, resonating strangely and breaking every few syllables into different octaves. If there was something I knew inspired fear, it was the uncanny valley. And what I just did to my voice sank into the deepest depths of that trench. Wade flinched away from me, clearly taken aback by the shift in tone. Maybe we do, one man said from the side. I oriented on him slowly, causing the man to shrink under my attention. Don't know until we hear what that bloke has to say, he finished meekly, but speaking up seemed to instill courage into the men around him. It was time to stomp out that bravery. Fireballs slowly popped into existence around me, one after the other. There were 10 men, and so 10 flickering orbs of flame orbited me and Wade in a small radius. The men around us flinched back. I stepped forward, capitalizing on the withdrawal. Wade, thankfully, had started to figure out my plan, and trailed behind me silently. Drip, drip, drip. My blood leaked into the snow. As the fireballs trailed around my head, I walked forward without a trace of the hesitance and nerves I felt inside. I flared my killing intent, pressing down on the people around me. The men parted in front of me, my show of power and flex of intent breaking their resolve. Nareni fell in lockstep behind me, following me as I slowly left the community bonfires. The weight of their stares, some hostile, some fearful, none sympathetic, rested on my shoulders like a mantle of steel, the emotions potent even from far away. I kept the fireballs hovering around me for a minute or two, then extinguished them when we were out of sight. The three of us ducked into an alleyway, and the young ice caster quickly checked our rears. It didn't look like anybody had followed us. What in the Vreetra's name happened? Nareni asked, a look of anger on her face. Her black hair had managed to escape its short braid, and she had to fight it back behind her ears. Why were they all looking like you were meat and they were Corallians that had just spawned in a zone? You didn't hear the mook? I asked, my look hollow. I was busy setting Great She's shoulder. When that one brute pushed her to the ground, she landed on it wrong. It was dislocated. I didn't hear what the man had to say. I sighed, massaging my eyes and the bridge of my nose. He said that Blood Joan promised him a lifetime supply of Blythe if he killed me. A bunch of the men found that offer interesting. I could visibly see the pain in Nareni's face as she heard what I had to say. She wilted like a flower that was left too long in the cold. They turned on you so fast, she said sadly. I closed my eyes. They had turned on me remarkably fast. I knew, at least intellectually, what addiction could do to a person. To their principles and morals. But to witness it firsthand, to be on the receiving end of such reverse personalities? I had danced with a few of those men not 5 minutes before, laughing along as others played the drums. And how quickly had they been ready to spill my blood? I joined the rats because I wanted this to change, Nareni said, a forlorn look on her face. I was the one who convinced Greed to start sharing her cooking around, gathering people to play music and dance. If we were a community, the drugs wouldn't rip them apart anymore. She blinked back, wetness around her eyes, but it's still the same. Wade rested a comforting hand on Nareni's shoulder. It's not the same, Nareni. I grew up here. It was so much worse before this. You know that. This is just a setback, yeah? And we're going to take down the Jones soon, too. We know where everything's made. They won't be able to do this to us again. I was bandaging my hand finally when I caught on to the words Wade said. You're going to attack the Jones soon? I asked, pausing mid-rap. That sounds a lot more definitive than what Carcian was hinting at. Wade looked a bit sheepish, adjusting his glasses. Well, see, the thing is that Carcian doesn't know we know where all the warehouses and the distillery are. But what he knows can't hurt him, the young sentry said. I'll tell him right before our operation, Nareni said. I'm not going to leave him in the dark indefinitely. Not like he did to me. She turned to me. I wasn't so sure about you before this, Torin. You're going to leave once the Jones are dealt with, so I didn't see why I should trust you. I held back a frown. I could see her point. I wasn't exactly planning on staying with this crew. It didn't build the best sense of camaraderie when you knew one of your teammates was only staying with you as a means to an end. And I didn't like how quickly Carcian let you in. But, Nareni continued, you're not so bad, Torin. Standing up to that thug holding the boy hostage showed me that. You're not like every other blood around here, even if you technically are one. I'm sorry for doubting you. I flashed back to when that man had held the boy hostage. I had trouble thinking, moving and acting only on instinct. I finished tying off my bandage, making sure it was secure. Apology accepted, I replied. I get why you'd be wary of me, but I do think what you're doing is good. I didn't like being doubted, but it was the logical feeling, in my opinion. That being said, Nareni began again, emboldened by my acceptance. Wade and I are planning to hit the Jones where it hurts, in their drug distillery and all the warehouses where they have stock. Before, I was the only striker who could actually infiltrate, but with you on board, our chances of success double, at least. I remember the desperation I saw in those Blythe addicts' eyes as they surrounded me, like starving animals getting a whiff of food. Part of my mind hadn't viewed them as human. At that moment, they were beasts, just like any other in the Clearwood forest. And I had treated them as such, warding them off with fire as a caveman did a wolf. My gut was a mix of negative emotions regarding that, and I didn't know which was most prominent. Disgust at myself for seeing those people as less than human, pain at being so quickly turned on, the smallest sense of bliss I had experienced since coming to this world tainted by betrayal, and anger at the Jones for putting the men in such a desperate state of mind. I would focus on that anger, center myself with it. It didn't take much time for me to consider the offer. I'm in, I said. I couldn't refuse. It'll be good to give Blood Joan a black eye again, and even better to do some good at the same time. Nareni beamed, rounding on Wade. All right, that's one recruited. Do you think we've got better chances now? Wade sighed. Yeah, I still say we need at least one more mage for this, though. Nareni began to scale a nearby building rooftop in quick hops, bounding up the side using ice daggers as makeshift picks. We won't need another mage if I'm there. I can get in and out of anywhere. Except your own messes, Wade muttered. I wall jumped up the alley after the ice striker. It was a precautionary measure. We left footprints that were easy to track on the ground, so the rats preferred the rooftops. Unfortunately, Wade had to use the stairs. A couple of hours later, I was carefully sifting through a small pile of books. My room was lit by a low lamp, fending off the dark. I could only hope it would be enough to read by. The book that looked the most interesting to me, at least off the top of the pile, was Treatise on the 4 Elements of Mana in Relation to Their Natural Counterparts, by Professor Frontfrost. I had asked Wade for a book on mana theory, as grounding my knowledge in familiar concepts would help me in every aspect of control, even if my teacher was an Asura. Furthermore, I enjoyed using my magic. The rush of mana flooding my mana veins, of the power and freedom it granted me, was something I wanted to hone even further. So I did one of the things I knew best. I read a book. It seemed I would be learning which came first, the element or the mana affinity. There has to be some sort of philosophical debate about that, I thought again. The unseen world washed over my vision, revealing Lady Dawn peering at the titles laid out on the table. Her hands were clasped behind her back, but she looked over the books. One was called Aldoreth's Encyclopedia of Stars, and had a nice, leather-bound cover. It was clearly an old tome, as the paper was yellowing and worn. The title was inscribed in silverish ink over the front, seeming to shimmer like the book's namesake in the sky. Another was Catalogue of the Constellations Movement across Alacria, which wasn't quite as high quality as the previous tome. Nonetheless, I hoped the Asura would enjoy it. Lady Dawn had left it up to me to guess what books I should rent for her, and I had taken a gamble on stars. She didn't look angry, which I thought was a point in my favor. The Phoenix pointed a delicate finger at the Encyclopedia of Stars. She hesitated, but only for a moment. Contractor, I would like this book set up for me. Interesting way to ask for help, I mused internally. I did so anyways, gingerly avoiding jostling my hand. It hurt, but even a couple hours in I could notice some of the healing. As I propped the book up nearby, keeping it close for whenever I needed to turn a page for my feathered companion, I spared another look at my wounded hand. It would probably take a couple of days to fully heal, as opposed to the many weeks it would have otherwise required. I remembered how the dagger went through my hand. My mana veins were more prominent than my mana channels, so it took more time than I'd like to direct mana from my core to the rest of my body. That was why I hadn't created a mana shroud in time to deflect the blow. Though I had a minor healing factor since coming to this world, I had always assumed it was a part of Lady Dawn's soul latching onto mine, or whatever had happened to reincarnate me. But as I learned more about magic, I realized how rare healing of the strength I had actually was. Furthermore, I had the healing before I had formed my bond with Lady Dawn. I still felt her presence in the back of my mind, always there but never listening. It was a strange aspect of our connection that I felt nervous to even think about, but now I was considering all I knew. Lady Dawn, I started. I heal really, really fast. I always thought that was because of our connection, but that's starting to make less sense to me. I paused. Am I mistaken, or? Lady Dawn turned to me from the page she had been scanning over. She considered me for a brief moment, her eyes catching on my wounded hand for a moment. You were correct in your assumptions, contractor, though only partially. I raised a brow. Partially how? I mean, which part am I wrong about? The phoenix's shade tilted her head. Not wrong, just lacking information. Our initial connection caused your ability to heal to manifest, as it did not exist before. My presence in your core brought latent ancestry to the surface, though not fully. I blinked, quickly realizing what she was implying. Wait, do I have the blood of the Jinn in me? The Jinn were the ancient mages who had set up the relic tombs across Alacria, as well as the flying city of Xyrus and Decathan's flying castle. In Decathan, latent Jinni heritage manifested as emitters, which were dedicated healers that could influence Viva Ether with their mana, allowing for potent healing spells. Not of the Jinn, Lady Dawn replied coolly. My brain stuttered on that. If not the Jinn, then what else? The words of the phoenix implied I was on the right track, but what else? Oh, I said, finally putting two and two together. I've manifested Vritra blood. That was the conclusion I came to, but it quickly faltered as I considered reality. But that didn't make sense either. I didn't have any horns or notable basilisk features and was sure I didn't have an affinity for any of the Vritra's deviant forms of mana. Still only partially correct, contractor, the phoenix replied. Most mages on this continent have very, very trace amounts of slumbering Vritra heritage in their blood. That is why your mages are born with your cores, after all. So, I had a Vritra parent somewhere, far up my bloodline? I asked, trying to comprehend. The phoenix nodded. Your latent Asuran heritage was not truly manifested. It is akin to a slumbering beast, one that sleeps for decades at a time. My intrusion upon your body caused the beast to stir. It flicked its tail, opened one eye, and then it went back to sleep. I frowned, not quite understanding. So, it's a partial manifestation? The Asura side, if that is what allows your mind to comprehend it. Your healing is accelerated as a result, but the beast has awoken once, and its slumber is lighter than what it once was. There is no telling what may probe it from its rest once more. You speak as if this is a bad thing, I said, confused. If I manifest Vritra blood, that's just more power to accomplish both of our goals. All the better, right? The phoenix looked at me with disappointment. And call attention to yourself from mages within Tegrin Kylum, who may wish to experiment upon you to draw that blood out even further. You would be pulled into Agrona's crosshairs, under his sights, and you do not wish for that. I deflated. Yeah, she raised a good point about that. It wasn't easy to hide Vritra blood manifesting, and it was a death sentence by law to assist someone in doing so. And even further, Lady Dawn continued, turning back to her book. I was certain she wasn't actually reading the words on the page now. The phoenix and the basilisk are fundamentally opposed. It is the nature of things, from the depths of our mana arts to the intricacies of our cultures. I do not know how a full manifestation of Vritra blood will react to my presence. The Asura looked at me again. This is new for me as well, contractor. I do not know what will come of this. I was left with those thoughts to ponder as the night wore on, only the flipping of pages to break the silence. Chapter 37, Confrontation. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vritra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between Asuran clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alacria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alacria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Nareni. I shuffled nervously in front of the entrance to Carson's room in the cistern. It had been a while since we had spoken to each other, the secrets he had kept from me looming between us like a chasm. But I had to talk to him now. Considering what I had planned, there was no way to keep it secret. Furthermore, if I kept what I was planning to do secret from my leader, I'd be doing the exact same thing to him that he did to me. I knocked on the wooden door, and then waited. And waited, and waited. I knew the man was in there, but after a minute of staring at the oak panels, I was starting to feel discouraged. When I was about ready to leave, a bit of irritation bouncing around in my mind at being ignored, I heard the telltale voice of Carsian calling out. Come in, Nareni, he called. Stealing myself, I swiveled back on my heel and opened the door. The inside of Carson's room was surprisingly gaudy for the thief. Little trinkets were displayed here and there, small prizes taken from our targets. A dartboard was hung next to the door, with several darts stuck around the bullseye. Carsian himself lounged on a small cushioned chair, a few darts set nearby. He had probably been throwing them before I came in. We faced off for a moment, an undercurrent of emotion traveling between us. He had his mask on. He rarely took it off, unlike the rest of the crew. He seemed unperturbed by my interruption, but I thought I knew him well enough to sense some uncertainty. I came here to tell you that I'll be going out on a mission soon, I said, mustering my courage. Carsian didn't react, at least not outwardly. I did not assign you any mission, he replied. You didn't. Then why do you claim to be going on one? I decided to on my own. Carsian shifted in his seat, crossing one leg over the other. He scrutinized me from afar. You haven't ever gone out on your own before, he said. Is this some sort of attempt at rebellion? Trying to get back at me for perceived injustice? There was a bit of condescension in the last question. He phrased it like I was a child, lashing out at my parents because I didn't understand why they kept the cookies away from them. I felt anger pulse in my head at that. I was not a little girl. No, it is not, I said irritably. I'm going to do something good for East Fiatra, instead of waiting around for pieces to fall into place. I'm going to make a difference, a permanent one, instead of just inflating a sinking ship with air. Carsian was silent for a moment. So you located the distillery, then? You plan to destroy it, and cut off the production of Blythe to East Fiatra? Yes, I replied, pulling myself up a bit straighter. I assume you're not alone in this, and you've planned all of this out? Every contingency, every possible point of failure? We have, I asserted. We're going to hit every warehouse in the distillery, all in one night. We won't give the Jones a chance to recover or react. Carsian finally stood up, his cloak unfurling behind him. He walked toward me, a relaxed gait measuring his steps. I took an involuntary step back, but the man simply went to the dartboard. He retrieved each of his darts, one by one. He inspected the darts carefully. No, you haven't. It is clear from how you speak. What will you do if one of your members fails to complete their target? I assume you'll be splitting up, trying to hit multiple targets at once. That's that many more places where your enemies can take you down. I felt my face flush slightly. We'll use Wade's sentry abilities to make infiltration to the warehouses simple. Their security is lax enough for us to make it through, and I have no doubt Torin and I will be able to burn those buildings to the ground in record time. In and out, quick as lightning. Torin is joining you? Carsian asked, a hint of something I didn't recognize in his voice. He turned to me, easily standing a head taller. I narrowed my eyes. He is. He sees the need to act too. Carsian inspected the dart in his hand. You'll fail if you try this, he said. Maybe you can destroy one warehouse. Maybe two, but the distillery will be guarded by the best the Jones have to offer. They'll see you coming from a mile away, and it won't be weak mages guarding it like the warehouses. They'll have their best. I ground my teeth. We won't fail, I said. I'm strong enough too. Your strength is irrelevant. Carsian cut across my words coldly. You don't understand, Nareni. You haven't fought many mages, but in an isolated space like this distillery, you'll be cut to pieces. Your plan will fail. I felt my anger eclipse my good sense. And what have you done to help me learn to plan? I spit out. All I do is follow your orders, going wherever you point like a lackey instead of a student. If you think my plans will fail, you only have yourself to blame. I immediately regretted my outburst. I was proving Carsian right, then. I sounded like a child, angry at her parents for actions they didn't understand. No, I reminded myself. Your anger is justified. It's not childish. And that is why I'll be helping your plan from now on, Carsian replied coolly, setting the dart down on a nearby table. What do you mean? I replied, still wary. Are you going to take over again, and push me to the side? No, Carcian said. He turned away from me, looking at the chair he had recently vacated. You're right, Nareni. I haven't been teaching you. I have kept you in your nest, unwilling to let you fly. I took a step back. Carcian, admitting he was wrong, I didn't know how to react to that. I'll help you with your plan, he said again. I will work with you to iron out any shortcomings. He turned back to me, and we'll finish this dance together. Torin Dane. Knocking on my door pulled me blearily from my sleep. I rolled off my cot, falling with a thump to the floor. Ow. What is it? I said groggily. I scrambled with my limbs to try and push myself up, jostling my hand in the process. Damn, that hurt. We're gonna have a team meeting in about half an hour, Wade said from outside my door. Just thought I should let you know. I blinked the sleep from my eyes. Oh, thanks. My mind wasn't really functioning just yet. I contemplated just staying on the floor, but finally convinced myself I needed to get ready. I had stayed up very late last night, completing that evening's assimilation process and working through some of my combat forms. It had been a while since I practiced those, and after the events of last night, I needed to work through some pent-up stress. I also further practiced the use of my telekinesis crest, fine-tuning the control of my pushes and pulls. There was something about the way the mana interacted in my telekinesis that was causing an itch in my subconscious, but I wouldn't be able to look into it until I was clean. My strawberry blonde hair had a layer of grease in it that I was determined to wash out, and I needed to change the bandages on my hand. Once again, I could feel a bit of mana build up in the hand. The wound didn't hurt as much as it did yesterday, but my constant use of mana over the course of the night had certainly hampered my healing. It was with trudging steps that I pulled myself into the cistern shower. It wasn't too dissimilar to the showers from my previous life, though the setup was clearly jury-rigged down here. As the warm water washed over my body, I used the calm the heat brought me to look into my mana core. There were cracks running along the surface of my light orange core, a network of slivers that shone yellow underneath. I was exceptionally close to the dark yellow stage of core development, which caused my heart to do a little flip of joy inside. Once I was washed up, I put on a dark long sleeve shirt and gingerly pulled on my gloves. At this point, I realized I could probably trust the company of the rat to see the red tattoo of chains snake from my palm to my sternum, but covering it up was becoming second nature. I was hiding a lot of things from them anyway. When I left my room, I was surprised to see the entire company sitting around the planning table. Especially Carcian. I hadn't seen the man for a few days since the blowout between him and Nareni, but now they were standing together. I blinked, making sure this wasn't a figment of my tired mind. He really was there, going over a few papers with Nareni. Wade peeked up from nearby, a rat on his shoulders. Ah, Torin, good to see you're awake. I smiled slightly. I would have rather you let me sleep, I admonished, then scanned the rest of the gathered rats. What's going on? Wade shifted slightly. Well, Nareni went to Carcian to tell him that she was going to go and destroy the Jones distillery. And, Carcian said he would help. How did that happen? Wade just shrugged, a look on his face that said he didn't know either. Nareni noticed me a second later, a slight smile on her face. She seemed a bit unsure to me, but that was smoothed over quickly. Torin, is everyone here, then? She scanned around surreptitiously. I sat at attention along with Wade, while Hoffel was smoking a cigar nearby. Carcian took a subtle step back, allowing Nareni to be the full focus of attention. Okay, this meeting was called to discuss a final attack against Blood Jones' Blythe operations in East Fiatra. The young striker conjured a long stick of ice, using it to point at several places marked on the Fiatra map behind her. There are 3 warehouses that hold Blythe around the northernmost parts of East Fiatra. They aren't directly operated by the Jones themselves, but Blood's Ylison, Fairiver, and Jasper. A couple of the warehouses were in South Fiatra, and I recognized the one from Blood Ylison. The last was along the border of East and North Fiatra. But the largest problem is the distillery itself, where the Blythe is produced. Nareni whopped another point on the map, this time in North Fiatra. This is where the Jones make their death drug in secret, then ship it to the warehouses for distribution across East Fiatra. They've gone to great lengths trying to hide its location from all prying eyes, including keeping most records of it off the books and trying to obscure it from everyone, even the supervisory offices. Nareni continued to rattle off a few more ways that the Jones had used to try and hide the location of their offices, some of which got pretty convoluted. I was surprised Wade had managed to even discover the location at all. I raised my hand, and Nareni pointed at me with her stick. Why are the Jones trying to keep the production of Blythe secret? I asked. This seems a little excessive to me if they're just trying to hide the location from us. They're not trying to hide the location from just us, but everybody, Nareni replied promptly. Blythe production is barely legal, and from what Wade told me, is especially difficult to make here in says Clar. Scythe Saris Ritra takes special offense to the drugs, so it's rare that it's actually produced in the Dominion instead of smuggled in. She's made it very clear that anybody who makes it will be on her shit list. Scythe Saris herself didn't like the production of Blythe. That was an interesting tidbit of info. Wade piped up after that. That's why it took so long to put some of the pieces together. For most of my life, any Blythe in Fiatra was smuggled in instead of produced locally. I knew the Jones were involved in distribution very early on, but it's very, very bold for any blood to actually produce the drug themselves instead of smuggling it. And I think they only started into the business more recently. I was left to stew on these revelations as Nareni continued her speech. But we're not going to let them do this anymore, the young leader said. We've got a plan to take all of these places down, and we're going to do it in a way that can't be ignored. And as Nareni began to lay out her plans, with periodic input from Wade and Carcian, I began to grin. If their ideas worked, then the ruckus it would cause would be unavoidable. Carcian brought up the very real problem that just because Blood Jones' distillery was destroyed didn't mean they couldn't simply make another one right after. While I wasn't sure they could, I remembered Bond's words about how Blood Jones was struggling financially. Somehow it wasn't just about the Jones. Any other blood could swoop in and pick up where they left off. And that's where Carson's prints on the plans showed. The takedown needed to be flashy and gaudy, drawing eyes from every power in the city, and maybe even from beyond. The destruction needed to be painfully visible, to send a message to all who might try and step up afterward. And I knew that a blow like this would guarantee the fall of Blood Jones. If they were caught producing Blythe, they would never recover. Several hours later, I was walking with Carcian through Great apartment building. He primly knocked on her door, his mask well in place. I was wearing my own rat's mask as well. This time when approaching the building, I couldn't take the streets. Being attacked last night served as a brutal wake-up call. If any drug-addled fool would try and assassinate me because of empty promises from Blood Jones, I couldn't show my face on the ground. So Carcian and I kept to the rooftops, bounding across and trying to stay covert. The snow was melting, making every step dangerous under the slippery conditions, but we made it all the same. Can she really help us? I asked Carcian nervously. You said her powers as an instiller would be able to give us an edge, but you didn't tell me what. Truthfully, I didn't doubt that the woman could help in some way. I just didn't want her to see me. Greed possesses a very unique crest, Carcian said, staring straight ahead. It has proven immeasurably helpful many times before, but now more than ever we'll need it. I shuffled nervously, but the door opened before I could ask another stalling question. Greed was there, her brown hair no longer in a bun. Her arm, the one she had landed on when the thug pushed her down yesterday, was in a sling. Nareni had told me she'd dislocated it. The woman's eyes took us in quickly, and though I was expecting it, the disappointment that radiated from her eyes when they landed on my mask still felt like a punch to the gut. She looked between us. No, she said aloud. No, I won't help you. Not this time. I asked you not to. I begged you to protect him. Not this. I tensed. Wade had told me that Greed had asked Carcian to simply watch over and protect me, not recruit me into the fold. You need to, Carcian said, undeterred. We're going to strike soon, Greed. Truly attack, and we can't rush in without the best preparations possible. She hesitated, an arm on the door. I could see the indecision warring on her face. She wanted to shut the door on us, and by proxy shut herself off from the violence. The woman visibly deflated, then moved out of the doorway silently. Carcian took this as a sign that he should enter, so he did. I followed behind, trying to avoid Great's eyes. When we were inside, Carcian withdrew something from his dimension ring I hadn't expected. I recognized it as a beast core, though it wasn't the same shade as the one I'd taken so long ago from the bark-skinned road. It was a deep blue, with shimmering lines of white rippling through the surface. Greed glanced from the core to Carcian, a resigned look across her face. At that moment, she seemed twice her age. This is the last time, Cars, she said, laying her hands on the core. It's getting too dangerous here. I can't go along with it anymore. Not after today. I felt mana swell from both of them, then churned toward the beast core. Their spells met in the middle, intertwining and converging in a strange mishmash of mana. My mind struggled to understand what was going on, my knowledge of the powers of this world too low to comprehend it. In a minute, the wavy blue lines inside the beast core shifted, wrapping and twisting to form a new shape. Soon, I could make out straight and legible strokes, coming together to form a single character. A rune, I realized. The inside of the beast core had a rune floating in the middle, glimmering with barely contained mana. I didn't recognize the rune, but it felt similar to the mana Carcian had been using. The rat tossed the sphere to me, surprising me. I caught it in one hand, then rolled it over to inspect it. I could sense water mana within, along with something containing and compressing the rune inside. That's yours, Carcian said. My mist spell is condensed inside the core. Breaking it will release the spell, causing everything nearby to have their senses dampened and obscured. That was incredibly versatile. Did that mean that Greed was able to store spells inside of beast cores? Or just runes? How did that work? How long were they good for? I looked up from the core. Can you store any sort of spell in any beast core? I asked, a bit excited. Greed shook her head. The mana beast the core came from had to have the same elemental affinity as the spell that I want to store, the woman said, looking weary. I can store deviant elemental spells in beast cores with the original element, however, but they don't last nearly as long. Though the woman's sadness took some of my excitement from my sails, I mustered on. Carcian was right about one thing. This was the final showdown. I'd need all the preparation I could get. I stored the spell-laden beast core in my dimension ring, then retrieved the trophy of one of my first victories in this world from the subspace. A brown core settled into my palm, with ridges of autumn orange within. I had taken this from the corpse of a bark-skinned road what felt like years ago. I stared at it for a moment. Is there anything you can do with this? Chapter 38, Mission Start. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrendane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @Afra_. Torrendane. Hoffel and I bounded over the rooftops, making a beeline for the warehouse owned by Blood Jasper. I jumped through the air, a pulse of telekinesis launching me a good 30 feet. The air whipped at my cloak, and it would have made a fluttering sound if I wasn't constantly suppressing any noise around me with my magic. I hit the next rooftop running. Hoffel jumped from where we had just been, using the extra strength his runes provided him to leap across the gap. Noticing he wasn't going to neatly clear the street below, I used 2 telekinetic pulls on his body, adding extra momentum to his leap. At the same time, I pulled on the opposite edge of the rooftop, using a single pull instead of 2. I ground my feet into the wood roof beneath me, making sure I wouldn't be lifted into the air by my own magic. Hoffel landed the jump with barely a stumble. With a nod, he ran toward the edge of the roof, making to leap again. I added a couple of pushes of telekinesis to his back, stabilizing myself so I wouldn't be thrown backward. He soared over a wide street, then kept running. I jumped after him, continuing our roof-bound trek toward the warehouse. Hoffel couldn't jump as far as I could, so whenever we reached a particularly wide gap I had to assist. It was a foggy night. The clouds hung low in the sky, blanketing the streets and obscuring the senses of all. For anybody else, it would be foolish to be running about right now. There could be thieves and scoundrels about, ready to jump you from the mists. But I was that thief and scoundrel, so I embraced the cover the fog provided. The Blythe warehouse we were going to was owned by Blood Jasper. It was just along the border wall of East and North Fiatra, making it far out of the way of the other 2 stockpiling locations further south. One of those was being tackled by Carcian and Nareni together. The other was assigned to Wade. Once those went up in flames, they'd all join Hoffel and me for a final assault on the distillery. After a bit of maneuvering, the buildings began to be more sparse. We were entering the wealthier relatively, of course, parts of East Fiatra. Our objective was easy to spot. The symbol of Blood Jasper was, unsurprisingly, an illustration of the mineral from which they got their name. With the logo plastered prominently on the large 3-story warehouse, it was easy to tell that this was our target. Hoffel settled onto the rooftop next to me. It had been explained to me that Hoffel and I would work together for the same reason Nareni and Carcian would. A more experienced mage working alongside a rookie helped balance out chances for failure. I stared at the windows of the warehouse. I knew the inner mappings of it well because of Wade's reconnaissance, and just like my last attack on a warehouse, I knew the best entry and exit points. Hoffel noticed my hesitation. The man wasn't smoking tonight, something I found a bit odd. His older face was hidden behind a familiar mask. Feeling nervous? He asked. A little, I admitted. I had talked with Lady Dawn a bit before finally setting out tonight. It had been a day since the plan was first explained to me, allowing me to get my thoughts in order. She had agreed with this course of action, believing it to be my best shot at Blood Joan. It's just, this is it. I've waited for months to actually hit the Jones, and tonight is that night. I would be avenging my brother soon. I felt a wave of guilt as I remembered that I hadn't even visited his grave since I left the Healers Guild in a huff all that time ago. Would I be able to when we were done? Would I deserve to? Hoffel nodded. If you weren't nervous, there'd be something wrong with you. Too many youths have rushed headlong into danger thinking themselves invincible, like a man thinking his knuckles are tougher than stone, then being surprised when they break after punching a brick. I turned to look at the man slightly. Hoffel acted as a sort of grandfather to the entirety of the rats, always offering emotional support and advice when it was needed. I learned recently that he had been one of Carson's regular ascension partners, and had followed him to Fiatra when he decided to start this merry band. I flexed my hand. It still hurt slightly, but the pain was proof that my blood was as red as it was in my previous life. I wasn't invincible. Just gotta do it, I muttered standing up. A few guards were circling the perimeter of the warehouse, something that I didn't have to worry about in my last heist. I could sense a bit of mana from them, too. It seemed word had gotten out that the rats had hid Blood Ellison. I dropped to the ground, silent as a shadow. Hoffel fell next to me, the collision of his boots on the cobbles muffled by my magic. We were still out of sight of the mages nearby, but probably not out of sensing range. When I was sure that the patrol had passed, Hoffel and I darted to the edge of the building. We only had a few seconds of blind spot to act. Hoffel began to focus on one of his runes, then touched the brick wall. It folded inward, the earth inside bending to Hoffel's will. It smoothed over the nearby bricks, bolstering a small ring around the opening with an extra layer of rock. The parts that smoothed over gained small patterns and shapes lined deep into the stone, showing marks of where Hoffel had touched. I grinned, then darted into the dimly lit warehouse. Hoffel followed a second later. There was a slight draft in the opening, but we wouldn't have time to try and close the gap. Apparently, Hoffel's shield crest focused solely on making earthen walls, but the source of that earth could be anything, and he utilized that to his advantage to peel an opening apart and reform it as walls on the side. Stacks of boxes piled up 10 feet in the air, covering the ground. A few of them had the stylized ember of Blood Joan on them, the illicit product inside proudly declaring their source. The mana signatures I sensed were more closely packed toward the offices on the opposite end, no doubt wary about another attempt to steal the precious money and information inside as we had a few days ago. But now the modus operandi of the rats was about to change. Hoffel withdrew a few flasks from his dimension ring. Inside each of the glass bottles was a certain trap gas, one that the sewers had in plenty. Methane. Prior to the operation, Nereni and Karsian had worked together to concentrate some of the released methane gas from the sewers into these tiny bottles. It was difficult work and their actions only yielded a few bottles with high enough quality, but we didn't need much. On top of the bottles was a small mana artifact that was the core of this operation, sealing them shut and keeping the deadly gas contained. Hoffel handed me a few of the bottles. I nodded to him in acceptance, then dashed to one of the first stacks. I set down the bottle in a corner of the boxes, right next to the Ember of Blood Joan. I pressed a button on the artifact, starting a countdown timer of 5 minutes. I moved stealthily from tower to tower, setting down bottles in opportune places and starting the timers. A few times I sensed a mage wandering near, which caused me to withdraw deeper into the shadows. The men around here were clearly on edge, from the hunch of their shoulders and the darting looks in their eyes. I'd show them why that fear was warranted. In a couple of minutes, I'd planted all the bottles in place. I covertly darted to the edge of the building at the agreed upon meeting place. This wouldn't have been possible without Wade's thorough scouting of the building interior, allowing me to plot a route near perfectly through the stacks of boxes. Hoffel arrived a minute later. I was starting to get antsy, the nerves from the countdown hurrying my steps. But I didn't need to worry. Hoffel arrived soon enough, none the worse for wear. He began to focus on the rune that allowed him to mold earth. Pressing his hand against the bricks, I watched as the bricks folded away, morphing them as he did before. The earth flowed as if liquid, and when reformed had a dozen different symbols and designs on it. But not fast enough. A mage rounded the corner, then froze at the sight of us. His eyes widened in alarm. He opened his mouth to yell, raising his staff between us. I dashed toward him, creating an echo of sound as I moved. He didn't have any time to react as my fist buried itself in his stomach, knocking all the air out of his lungs in a wheeze. I dropped him a second later, but that brief bit of time was enough noise to alert everyone else. It didn't matter. We'd already set the flasks, and from my internal counting, there was barely more than a minute left on them. Hoffel had moved outside the wall. I could hear the bustle of men moving as I dragged the unconscious mage to the opening, hopefully getting him clear of the warehouse interior. Outside, I could hear the sounds of a faint scuffle. When I poked my head out into the night air, Hoffel had already knocked a few mages unconscious. But between that and the noises from inside, our cover was effectively blown. "We've got to go," I said, stating the obvious. "Only a couple of seconds until those things go off." Hoffel nodded, running back into the streets. I bounded after him, using telekinesis to help me catch up to him. A few guards noticed our frantic escape, calling after us and preparing for pursuit. I could feel their mana flaring, preparing some spells to throw. Before they could even try, the first of the methane flasks went off. Hoffel was good with artifacts and machines. He was the one who had set up rudimentary plumbing to the cistern, leeching off the city's water lines. But what he made here was far more flashy than a water pump. Inside each of the mana timers was the head of a cigar lighter. When the timer reached its end, a small contraption struck two bits of steel together, causing a single spark. And that was all it took. I couldn't see it, but I knew a couple of the flasks had exploded. The bursts weren't large. They weren't designed for that, after all. Instead, they threw fire to all the crates nearby. And Blythe was very, very flammable. The chain reaction was audible as the crates exploded behind us. Booms sounded out loud, acting as thunderous applause to our victory. A few nearby window panes rattled from the noise, making me grin. I leapt into the air, aiming for the rooftops. I pulled Hoffel after, working in tandem to get him on the roof with me. I could already smell the smoke. I turned around, looking at the warehouse which was already a block or so away. Thick black smoke billowed out its windows, tinged with a strange scent I couldn't recognize. Probably the Blythe burning. Using the devices as we did instead of actual spells was intentional. Spells could be sensed and detected by mages, while mana artifacts were more difficult to pinpoint, especially ones so very small. Planting those devices gave the least chance of discovery. I watched from afar as the smoke poured out of windows, part of me hoping the mages inside managed to find a way to escape the hellfire. Most of the people I could sense inside were huddled near the main offices, expecting to have to fight off thieves reaching for their wealth. Instead, we sent their product up in flames. But another part of me didn't care. These men willingly guarded this death drug, seemingly content to help their employers further poison the denizens of East Fiatra. I should let them burn in the aftermath. My own thoughts on the vigilante justice I was performing were manifold. The me from Earth would be utterly appalled at what I had been doing. Going after drug makers, stealing from people? But that was my previous world. On Earth, there was a due process that, while not perfect, did protect those at the bottom. If a millionaire beat me up on the street, I could expect outrage from the public and a settlement in court. Here, you turned the other cheek. You were weak, so you suffered and only had yourself to blame. It was ingrained, even into Torin himself. The smoke stretching into the sky warned me that the window to attack the distillery would begin to close now. I didn't know how good of an information network Bloodjohn possessed, but all three warehouses being struck in succession was a blaring siren telling them that everything Blythe related was going down. I trusted Nereni, Karsian, and Wade to finish their assignments just fine. What I was worried about was the assault on the distillery. In both my and Lady Dawn's opinions, there were many flaws to this plan. I questioned some things about it. Why not wait to destroy the distillery after the warehouses, and prepare more thoroughly? Couldn't we try and get more information about the distillery before attacking it? Karsian had pointed out that the Jones were likely to pull their distillery underground if the warehouses were destroyed. And besides, the point of the operation was to be big and loud. There were always going to be pitfalls in attacks like this. Not every variable could be accounted for. Hoffel patted me on the shoulder reassuringly. Pulling myself back to the present, I turned northwards toward the tall dividing stone that separated the rich from the poor. It was a living monument to the truth of this canal city, no matter its beauty. Instead of trying to leap over the wall like I did the first time, Hoffel and I dropped into the sewers once again. The sewer systems between East and North Fiatra ran on different lines because the wealthy refused to let their shit mix with that of the poor. But there were places where they ran close enough that Hoffel's rune could peel the gap apart. I trudged through the wet muck of the North Fiatra sewer, each step taking me closer to my goal. I thought over the plan one more time, trying to iron it into my memory. Karsian, Nereni, and Wade were further from North Fiatra than we were. The rat and his protege were busy destroying their own warehouse, while Wade sent rats carrying bottles of methane into his assigned warehouse to deposit the mini explosives remotely. Wade had done some initial reconnaissance of the distillery building, but his range and control with his crest didn't extend far enough to allow him to spy as well as he wanted. He had to be within a certain radius of his rats for them to maintain their orders, and apparently, the area around the distillery was being watched heavily enough that it made it difficult for him to approach. That was where Karsian came in. His mist spell would allow us to approach a lot easier, masking our positions from the enemy. It would also be indistinguishable from the fog that was already obscuring so much of our natural vision. Wade would be able to get close, allowing him to get more accurate details of the structure and its layout from his tiny little minions. Hoffel and I reached a ladder, which allowed us access to the world above. We climbed out slowly, then the shield used his signature artifact to freeze off the remnants of sewage on my boots. North Fiatra felt wealthy, even under the starlight. The canals were narrower, fitting the more personal nature of the blooded district. The average house rose 3 stories tall instead of the normal 2, and lighting artifacts lined the streets, keeping everything in perpetual illumination. Unlike the warehouses, the distillery wasn't above ground. It was nestled underneath a nondescript cabin that bordered a canal. Wade didn't know much about the interior, but he did relate to us that the side of the canal slid away, revealing an access port for small boats carrying men and shipments deeper within. I vaulted onto a nearby roof, then helped Hoffel up. This was the agreed upon meeting place for our group, as the area directly around the distillery was tightly monitored. But as I settled in to wait, something began to gnaw at me. The streets around were too quiet, too deserted. Where everywhere else I heard the chirping of crickets and the buzz of lighting artifacts, now there was only a strange silence. It was like the world had exhaled its last breath here. Hoffel shifted where he stood, his eyes darting around nervously. Whatever it was, he sensed it too. I covertly scanned my surroundings, cautious and on edge. Was there something I missed? It took a minute for me to finally put the pieces together. There's nobody patrolling around, I realized with confusion. Even the warehouses had mages constantly circling about, but I can't sense any mana signatures. I frowned, feeling a mix of confusion and dread. Wade had said that this place was patrolled heavily enough that he couldn't approach close enough, so why? I turned to look in the direction I knew the distillery was. Something was wrong here. I ran over all that I knew in my head. The current situation didn't match what Wade had spoken of, which meant either something had changed, or the young librarian was wrong, which I didn't believe. But what had changed? I needed to know. I was the most mobile of the rats, so I had the best chance of noticing the difference and getting out quickly. Hoffel, I said, trusting my instincts. They'd gotten me through the Clearwood Forest. They'd get me through here. I'm going to scout ahead for a little bit. I've got a bad feeling about this. Hoffel started. Wait a few minutes for Carcian to get here, the older ex-ascender said. I agree that there's something off right now, but rushing headlong in will only limit your options. That caused me to pause. Hoffel was right. If I waited a little bit, then I'd have backup in the form of Carcian and Nareni. But the part of me that was telling me something was off was also screaming that whatever was here, I didn't want them to be a part of it. A shiver ran down my spine as I thought over the problem in front of me. If there was danger up ahead, it was better that I alone encountered it. I was more powerful than I let these people think. I shook my head. No, that's not a good idea. I'll just go a few blocks over and check to see if anybody is actually watching the distillery. Wade said that the security around here was tight, but I can't sense a living soul. Hoffel stilled. I still say you should wait for backup. I've known too many warriors who died because they've had a gut feeling. I licked my lips, peering through the illuminated streets. Then you better hope I'm not one of them. Chapter 39, Misdirection. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrendane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vritra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrendane. I approached the distillery building carefully, jumping from rooftop to rooftop. The shadows masked me well this high up, the darkness cloaking me like a friend. I'd left Hoffel behind. My speed allowed me to outpace any pursuit he tried, so I didn't know if he was trying to follow or not. With luck, I'd be back to the meeting spot in a few minutes. Every now and then I checked my surroundings, a part of me hoping I'd spot some sort of patrol. That would banish my fears. I found nothing. No hide nor hair of man or woman rewarded my search. The streets remained quiet, creating an eerie feeling when combined with the persistent fog. I felt like I was being watched from the haze, but no eyes met my own. The mist was pervasive and ever-present, and where before I had viewed it as an ally for this heist, now I watched it with wary caution. Anything could hide in the fog. My anxiety ratcheted up a notch as I finally spotted the building I knew was a facade for the underground factory. A long street led up to it, with smaller buildings on either side. Right past the building was a winding canal, the water drifting along lazily. A bridge connected the street from one side to the other. The banks were steep, nearly a sheer 90 degrees. Unlike most waterways, the banks were also tall. If anybody fell in, they'd be stuck without magic or assistance. The fog gave the water in the canal a wide berth, something I didn't quite understand. What could cause that? My actual target was a mostly wooden structure. It was short and quaint, looking like a canal-side cabin rather than the front for drug mixing operations. I could almost imagine myself relaxing outside on a Saturday morning, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise from the nice wraparound porch they had. I dropped to the stones, muffling the sound I made as I landed. I couldn't use my normal roof hopping methods anymore. The distance was too great. As I approached the building, I thought over all I knew. There wasn't any human presence nearby and I couldn't sense any mages. Wade's investigations were all I had to go on regarding this place, but everything he had told us minus the actual physical description of the building had turned out to be false. No heavy presence of people, no covert guards that kept him away. Had he been wrong? No, I didn't think so, which left few other options. Was I acting impulsive on purpose? Part of me wondered. I was so close to my goal. Was I simply finding an excuse to rush the last few feet to my vengeance, like a sprinter pushing themselves once more near the end of a marathon? The handle of the cabin door taunted me, like a dancer holding out their hand. Would I accept their waltz, stride into the abyss? I stared at it for a moment as the reality of the situation sunk in. The absence of presence could only mean that the Jones had expected an eventual assault on their distillery and had moved it. There was no way they would wait for the rats to attack them here. I sighed inaudibly, the constant sound suppression I kept up masking the noise. The rats would have to start another game of cat and mouse, scrambling after leads blindly and trying to pin down a foe with far more resources than they had. The destruction of the warehouses would make the Jones far more cautious. They'd go underground, and there would be no telling how difficult it would be to uproot them once again. I turned around, planning to go back to the nearby rooftops. Hoffel would receive depressing news. Maybe he'd tell me a story about how the construction of a building always had its pitfalls to cheer me up. A click sounded from behind me. It was barely audible, akin to the sound of a cigarette lighter sliding metal. It was hardly noticeable. In fact, I wouldn't have drawn my attention if not for my enhanced sense of hearing in the utter stillness of the night. And because our little methane bombs made the exact same sound. Replacing the earlier silence, my senses screamed at me from inside my head. Acting purely on instinct, I flared my crest. Familiar warmth coursed from my core to my back, my telekinesis rune activating under my will. I threw everything I had into a push behind me, pressing against the door that still remained innocuously closed. I rocketed forward into the street, propelled by my crest. Not fast enough. A detonation followed, a wave of heat and force at my back. A deafening explosion propelled me forward just as much as my own telekinesis, a blinding flash of light blocking out my sight for a moment. I felt the fire sear at my back, my mana shroud barely protecting me from the licking flames. The force of the explosion behind me sent me tumbling through the air. I hit the ground 30 feet away twice, rolling painfully before instinctively trying to balance myself midair. My feet stumbled on the cobblestones, then I rolled a bit more before skidding to a halt. I coughed, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. My vision was fuzzy from the cacophonous flash of light, and I blinked multiple times as I struggled to my feet. I needed to take stock of myself, make sure I wasn't hurt. I was in the center of the wide street, having been flung a good 50 feet from the center of detonation. The cape of my cloak had been burned completely, causing me to discard what was left. The arms of my shirt had been charred as well, exposing a bit of my tattoo. I felt dull pain from where I'd tumbled, but I was certain nothing was broken. That was good. What wasn't good was the smoldering ruin of the cabin by the canal. Smoke billowed high into the air, a twisted reflection of the burning warehouse I had left behind not half an hour ago. There had been a bomb inside that building, but now there wasn't even much of a building left. The Jones didn't just know we'd hit them, I realized with grim horror. They were planning for it. I finally sensed mana presences popping up around me. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dread threatened to consume me. They had me surrounded from all sides, boxing me into this extremely exposed position. A few stepped out into the street, leveraging weapons in my direction, but most stayed in the shadows. My eyes darted around, trying to find a route of escape. I had to get out of here and warn the others. That blast was probably meant to kill every one of the rats, but I'd only escaped due to my supernatural hearing and telekinesis. But then a fifth mage dropped from a tall building, landing in front of me 15 feet away. They were dressed in dark colors. A stiletto was secured on a belt at their waist. A cloth mask kept their feminine figure somewhat hidden, but not the eyes. Not the eyes. They were gray as steel, and I might have mistaken them for cold apathy if I couldn't recognize a boiling hatred in them. It was barely restrained, kept in place by an effort of will. Any wrong move, any twitch forward would unleash the tide held behind those eyes. I knew that hatred, that bitter fury. I knew it because I felt it threatening to break out of myself, the object of my ire finally standing across from me. The woman who had killed Norgan was less than 20 feet from me, tense like a cat ready to strike. Thoughts of warning the rats immediately vanished, my focus solely on the woman in front of me. I stiffened, my hand drawing my dagger. The steel in my white knuckle grip promised blood retribution. Kaelin Joan, I hissed. My voice wasn't altered by sound magic. I wanted it to be heard, as it was in nature, as it was when she slew my brother. The entire perimeter around me was fraught with tension. The mages were primed to attack and finally complete their pincer movement to take me down. But my attention narrowed on the woman across from me like tunnel vision. The only thing I could see was that stiletto on her hip driving its way through my brother's chest. Norgan's murder shifted on her feet, lightning crackling from her fists. I promised you that the scion would end your miserable life, she snarled, rage breaking through her composure. But you spat on my gift. Attacking your betters has resigned your fate to one far worse than promised. She rolled her shoulders. I'm going to give you a death far slower than your weakling brother got. You wasted my mercy. I dashed toward her with a roar, using a burst of telekinesis and fire to fling me forward at unimaginable speeds. I channeled mana through my steel, hardening it and sharpening it for when it would dig into Kaelin Joan's flesh. I swung my blade in a crescent arc, fire coating my weapon as the edge called for blood. I watched Kaelin's eyes widen in shock as I closed the distance between us in a heartbeat. My dagger cut into her arm, but the striker used a burst of speed to hastily move backward, sparing her any further cuts. Unwilling to let my advantage go, I started to harry Kaelin. She was slow to react, my initial attack having caught her off guard. Lightning began to appear on her arms, a familiar spell form that I had seen before. You killed my brother, I spat through the onslaught. You're going to burn for what you've done. Burn like your fucking drugs. Before I could continue my assault, however, I felt something wrap around my ankle. I was tugged backward off my feet and then hurled toward where I started. A whip-like cord of water held my leg tight as it slammed me back into the concrete, away from my enemy. I felt some of the breath leave my body, a measure of the impact getting through my mana shroud. The spell traced back to one of the 4 other mages that surrounded me, something I had somehow forgotten in my rage. Imbuing a shroud of sound over my dagger, I cut at the tendril of water that held my leg. The spell was severed, and not a moment too soon. A barrage of spells was aimed at me from 2 separate corners, their casters shielded by the shadows of buildings. Trying to reorient myself, I used a burst of telekinesis on the ground, pushing myself into the air. The spells a gale of cutting wind and bullets of water passed through where I had just been. I sensed something approaching, but I was too late to react. A torrent of fire splashed against me, blowing me back to the ground in a roll. The spell burned at my clothing even more, tearing at the dark fabric. I grit my teeth, then focused on one of my spells. Sound mana surrounded my palm in an oil-like sheen, building and building to a crescendo. Then I slammed my palm into the earth, causing slight tremors and a crashing boom to echo out into the foggy night. The fires around dispersed from the shockwave, but it was far less effective than I'd hoped. The mana I could sense being prepared for another wave of spells paused only for a moment then began to build again. I barely brought my dagger up in time to deflect the lightning-clad strike of Kaelin Joan, who had maneuvered into my guard with deadly precision. She stabbed with it again, something I narrowly diverted in a shower of sparks. Some of those were from metal on metal, but more were from the errant spells of my enemy. Every collision of steel sent tendrils of electricity snaking up my hands, the automatic defense of my enemy searing my flesh and making my grip spasm. My rage, while still burning hot inside of me, began to simmer off as Kaelin Joan kept me occupied. My counters and deflections were off balance because of each and every electric twitch, causing me to adjust haphazardly as I was forced on the defensive. Cuts opened here and there along my body as I was edged back. Yet I could see her movements now. She wasn't a blur to me like she was when she slew my brother. But she had 4 other mages providing suppressing fire for her, keeping me stuck in this little patch of road. I needed to get out of this encirclement. Moving through one of the combat forms Lady Dawn had taught me, I used the edge of my blade to redirect Kaelin Joan's. Instead of sinking into my stomach, it passed near my ribcage instead. Lightning jumped from her blade to my body, though, battering against my mana shroud and making me sweat. I shifted stances slightly, gathering a fireball in my palm. Then, I used my momentum from the deflection to deliver a brutal counter. The heel of my palm sank into the stomach of my brother's murderer, pressing the condensed ball of fire into her abdomen. The electricity coating Kaelin's body sent spasms up my hand, causing it to convulse, but my own fireball detonated, sending Kaelin hurtling away. I whirled on my feet, gathering mana under my heel. I tried to rocket toward the nearby buildings, knowing that my hampered mobility here was a death sentence. I soared straight into a bubble of water. My momentum bled off of me as I was caught by the spell. I exhaled in surprise, losing precious air and taking in water. My eyes widened in alarm, darting down to the mage who had cast it. She was familiar. Mira, the woman who had run away to save herself in the Clearwood forest. The bubble of water slammed back down into the pavement, bursting in a small deluge. I coughed out liquid, coalescing another sound grenade in my hand. I was starting to feel desperate. They trapped me here. I threw the sound grenade upward, hoping the blast of noise would give me a reprieve from the constant onslaught. I just needed to get them off balance. Another bubble of water, this one from a different mage, leapt out like a beast to swallow my spell. It detonated inside audibly, but the water had done its job, muffling the sound of my attack. I was dripping with water, disoriented from being thrown around. My head felt like it was full of cotton, but I forced through the haze to fight. Another salvo of wind and fire converged on my position, aiming to kill me where I stood. I pushed myself backward with telekinesis, avoiding the spells, but I lurched right into Kaelin Joan's blade, which sank into my left shoulder with electric pain. The sadistic striker ripped the weapon free in a spray of blood, then kicked me in the stomach, sending me flying back to where I started. The water I was drenched in directed the lightning across my body, making me shudder as my muscles twitched involuntarily. Did you think we didn't plan for you, you filthy peasant? Kaelin snarled, stalking forward. Blood streamed down my shoulder, but I pulled myself to my feet. We've got a watercaster and shield here for a reason. You won't be able to pull any of your tricks to save your measly little life. I coughed, doing an unconscious check of my shoulder. The stab wound wasn't deep, but the lingering lightning mana caused it to spasm periodically. I couldn't reliably clench my fist there, and the wound already ached. Kaelin Joan stood 10 feet away from me, breathing heavily as she glared at me. A deep cut marked her upper tricep from my initial attack against her, and it was bleeding even more heavily than my own wound. Her glare redoubled my fury. For all that I was outnumbered and cornered, she had no right to feel angry at me. My anger? It was justified, a blade of vengeance quenched in the blood of my dying brother. I had honed myself to draw its edge across her throat. She didn't like that I disrespected her family. It was the tantrum of a child who had their toy house knocked over. I snarled, settling back into my stance. I didn't know if I'd make it out of this, but I would take that devil with me. I had already died once. Another time would only be fair if I could take that woman with me. Lady Dawn, I thought, using the telepathic connection of our bond seriously for the first time since it was made. I do not know if I will escape this, but in case I do not, I hope you can forgive me for failing in your vengeance. I didn't hear any reply. I didn't expect to. I planned to complete my own revenge at the cost of my own life. There was something selfish about that. The Phoenix promised me power to use for not just accomplishing my goals, but hers as well. But I was expecting to die here, only fulfilling one end of the bargain. It was morbidly amusing. In the end, I would end up being a greater thief than anything Carcian could ever dream of. Who would think to steal the power of an Asura, only to let it burn away like this? I spread mana throughout my body, reinforcing it in the natural shield around me. My dagger had a chip in it from its previous clashes against Kaylin Jones' stiletto. No doubt that accursed weapon of hers was forged from better materials. But it had proven my dagger could draw her blood. Before I could launch myself at them, I heard another click. Where before the subtle sound had only rung once to prelude destruction, now it sounded several times. My eyes darted to a spherical object that had bounced on the cobblestones nearby, making clinking sounds as it rolled. It was dark brown and unnaturally smooth. Orange streaks threaded through the small sphere, constantly twisting and morphing into random shapes. I felt a grin creep onto my face as realization dawned on me. That was a beast core, one I'd given to Nareni. After all, the spell that I'd stuffed inside with help from greed would be wasted on me. Kaylin Jones' eyes widened in alarm, right before the beast core exploded. Chapter 40, To Avenge. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrin Dane. A sound like the detonation of a bomb stacked upon itself a dozen times over echoed outward. It was like an explosion crossed with the sound sheet metal makes when rattled, except ramped up to absurd decibels and with a bit of reverb. Needless to say, most of the mages around Kaylin and I fell to their knees. But I was unaffected. The spell inside the beast core had been made of my own mana, meaning that it could not harm me if I didn't want it to. I fished inside my dimension rune, using the distraction provided to withdraw another beast core. Inside the bluish sphere, a white rune floated serenely, far more stable in appearance than the earlier sound bomb. I caught a quick glimpse of Nareni and Hoffel dropping to the ground, intent on ambushing the mages concussed by the sound bomb. But I didn't have much time to look. I crushed the beast core in my hands. It cracked like stone, splintering and releasing the captive spell inside. Mist burst from the orb, billowing outward like the wall of a storm. It engulfed everything in a 5-yard radius instantly, dampening the senses of all who were unaware and unkeyed to the spell. Carson's spells were versatile as hell. If he envisioned a person's mana signature as he cast his cloaking spells, the mist would not obstruct their senses. And considering my own senses remained as keen as ever, I knew it was a success. Kaylin Jones, however, she was trapped in a swirl of deathly fog, unsure as to what had just happened. Thank you, Carsian, I thought. The man had promised me a shot at Kaylin Jones. This was as close as anything. I rushed at the woman, using all the speed I could muster. My blade carved through her side, streaking blood and breaking through her electric defenses. She screamed in agony. I relished that scream. When I heard it, I could almost imagine that it washed away the pain in my shoulder. I threw a hook at the woman, but she darted backward, trying to escape the mist. I followed in dogged pursuit, harrying her attempts to outmaneuver justice. Wherever she moved, I followed, striking low and not allowing her a second to breathe. Our blades sparked as they bounced off each other, and though each clash left my dagger a little more worn, it also came back with droplets of blood. Kaylin Jones burst out of the mist, her eyes gleaming with hatred. And maybe a little fear. Like a predator sensing weakness, I continued after, not letting up on the woman. She deflected a strike of mine to the side, but I used the momentum to punch her in the ribs, right where I had drawn a line of blood earlier in the mists. She gasped, but the knuckle guard of my dagger connecting with her temple sent her sprawling backward. Electricity sparked off the blow, running down my arm and causing my hand to twitch slightly. I looked down at my arms. The sleeves of my shirt had burned off a while ago, exposing the red tattoo that snaked from my palm upward. Lightning burns sprawled over my fingers, but the pain was dulled by my adrenaline. My left arm spasmed every now and then from the stab I had taken, the residue of lightning mana sending jolts along my nerves. My shirt was slowly burning away, too. I couldn't bring myself to care, even if it was one of my last good ones. The signet ring of named Blooddane felt warm against my chest, the chain that kept it around my neck cold in contrast. My brother's murderer stumbled backward, but the brief inspection of myself allowed her to recover. She lashed out with her dagger, electricity coating it as she blurred toward me. We exchanged a flurry of blows, but I had focused myself, centered my anger in a way that drove me on. The last time she and I had fought, I hadn't even been able to track her movements. But with mana enhancing my vision and the constant practice of the Clearwood Forest backing me, I was able to evade and deflect her blows with precision. Kaylin Jones snarled bestially at me, recognizing the tide of the fight had turned. I was no longer trapped in her encirclement, and the rats were systematically taking down the mages in the fog behind me. It was just me and her now. The woman thundered forward, tendrils of yellow lightning striking at the ground around her feet. They scorched rivulets into the cobblestones, sending bits of dust into the air. The dagger forms taught by an Asura guided me along in this deadly combat. I watched the woman get more and more frustrated as her attacks failed to connect. The only damage she had done was through the lightning around her lashing out at me, burning me slightly for every exchange. But it was far from enough to actually slow me down. But fighting was starting to make me fatigued. My muscles burned, and if it wasn't constantly being ionized by close contact with a living bolt of lightning, I was sure there would be sweat on my arms. One of my counters came up short, a spasm running through my left arm stalling my movement. I recognized at the moment the striker did as well, a gleam in her eyes, some vindictive cruelty in her eyes. She lunged at me, her needlepoint weapon closing the distance to my sternum. I wouldn't be able to dodge this. My stance was off slightly and overextended. The best I could do was compensate, take the hit, but no. Unwilling to let the woman draw a drop more of my blood, I pushed my will into my telekinesis crest. I used 3 pushes again, all layered atop one another against the woman in front of me. The last time I tried to use my crest to affect this woman, her lightning defenses had automatically destroyed my mana construct before it could act. I was worried the same would happen again. I shouldn't have been. With the weight of my training backing up my magic, my telekinetic push flared white, shrugging off the little zaps that tried to disperse it. My push connected with my foe, sending both of us tumbling back. I balanced myself quickly, squaring off with the Joan once more. Only a minute or so had passed since I had escaped the enclosure and the sound of battle within the mist behind me was starting to clear up. I realized something then, staring across at my nemesis as our blood dripped to the ground beneath us. My breathing was heavy, and my muscles tingled from the fight. I reached a hand up to my mask, grabbing it and ripping it off my face. I threw it to the ground in front of me. For all the time I'd been in this world, I'd been driven by vengeance against Blood Joan. But the idea of vengeance was vague. What did I actually want to do? Was I going to bleed their family dry, ruining their finances and crippling them economically? Was I going to track down all those who had harmed me and make them face the same pain? Was I only going to expose their corruption and drug dealing? But as I stalked toward the woman across from me, I knew what I was going to do. I didn't want to admit it to myself, didn't want to acknowledge I could do such a thing. But as I met the eyes of my brother's murderer, I knew I was going to kill her. I was going to sink my dagger into her heart and twist. Unlike the scanders of the Clearwood Forest, I would relish each moment of dragging the edge of my blade over Kaylin Jones' body. I moved forward, grim fury fueling each step. I saw Kaylin Jones' own anger waver in the air, like the light of a candle flickering as a storm approaches. She wasn't used to her enemies fighting back. She didn't know how to handle this. I made a promise that day, too, I said, settling back into my stance. When you killed my brother, when you left him to bleed out in an alley like a dog, I promised Blood Joan wouldn't get to finish the job. I'll fucking kill you, Kaylin said, though the way she shuffled backward took the confidence from her statement. I'm going to kill you, and then I'll hang your corpse atop our gates. No, I said in reply. You can feel it now. You're powerless here. I narrowed my eyes. Something about what I said caused the bit of sense that had surfaced to vanish. She rushed me, her spell forms activating and driving her along. She thrust her stiletto forward, a painfully choreographed attack. I smacked it to the side with my own weapon, but the deflection cost me. My dagger, already battered and worn from the brutal combat I had put it through, shattered in the act. Metal shards sprayed to the side, my weapon finally destroyed. Kaylin Joan radiated triumph in that split instant. She thought herself victorious. I didn't know what she looked like beneath the mask that had haunted my dreams, but I could feel her smile as she felt victory approaching. But I pushed on the metal shards with my telekinesis, accelerating them in a flash of white. They impacted my enemy's leg like the spray of a shotgun shell, ignoring her electric defenses and shredding her leg to a meaty pulp. She screamed in agony as the corpse of my dagger embedded itself into her thigh, giving her dark ensemble a splash of red. Kaylin's lightning shroud spell cut out, the concentration it must have required completely obliterated by agonizing pain. And it is not yet done. I used a push of telekinesis on the striker from above, shoving her down and making her put more weight onto her ruined leg. It predictably buckled from the strain, causing her to tumble down. It brought her chin directly into the path of my fire-shrouded knee. I felt the satisfying crunch of bone as the blow threw her into the air, the burst of fire obliterating her cloth mask and adding another echoing scream. Kaylin Joan's body hit the cobblestones in a wet thunk, quivering and screaming in pain. Her leg was unrecognizable above the knee and was bleeding copiously. From what I could see in the darkness, my last attack had shattered her jaw and burned part of her face. A distant part of my mind diagnosed the injuries, telling me the likelihood of survival and recovery from such a wound. Seeing how much blood was leaking from what I'd done to her leg, I was sure it was a fatal wound. The shrapnel had likely nicked an artery. If the bleeding wasn't staunched in a few minutes, she'd expend her life there. And as I began my slow march to finish my vengeance, the wretch of a woman tried to claw herself up. Lightning danced around her, fizzling up and sparking intermittently. It looked like what cartoons displayed when a character smashed a fuse box. Broken. As I got closer, I could hear her making sounds from her broken jaw. There were tears streaming down her face, meeting the burned section of her chin. She was missing most of her teeth. Kaylin Joan was trying to pull herself away from me, scratching at the cobblestones in an attempt to flee. I looked at her, looked at what I'd done to this woman, and I felt pity. Right now, she was another scander from the forest, a broken beast that wouldn't survive in the wild. I was reminded of the first time I had used my dagger, ending the life of a monobeast who had tried to kill me. The way my steel sunk into its flesh was visceral and gut-wrenching. But then I saw her stiletto a few feet from her body, the same one that had tasted my brother's blood. And I was reminded that this was no simple beast. It was a person, with all the cruelty and malice one could possess. Not an animal seeking a way to survive. I walked toward the struggling wretch, bringing my boot down hard on her dagger as I walked by. My mana-empowered stomp snapped the blade in two. My hands tightened on the handle of my own dagger, still clutched in my palm. It was shattered, but there were shards attached to it that would finish this job. As I knelt down next to Kaylin, I noticed that she had short, sandy blonde hair. She'd always been a black silhouette in my nightmares, a faceless monster that had no human features. But the terror in her eyes as she tried to escape was very, very human. I remembered my own issues with killing when I first entered this world. The slice of the knife was intimate, a personal way to end a life. But I wouldn't hide from the gruesome nature of what I had to do. I hesitated for a long moment. Then, with a single, quick flick, I drew what was left of my dagger across the woman's throat. She didn't even seem to notice, the shock and haze from her earlier wound masking whatever cognition she had left. Carotid artery severed, less than a minute to bleed out. With current blood loss, less than that, the medical part of my mind provided. I watched as the lifeblood of my brother's killer painted the cobblestones, flowing out in a pumping rhythm. My breathing began to quicken as the light faded from Kaylin Joan's eyes, a fog overtaking them. But where Carson's spell would only temporarily rob one of their senses, the haze that clouded Kaylin Joan's eyes would never relent. She was dead. I stared at the body for a moment, the crushing fatigue of my battle catching up to me. My arms had lightning scars all along them, and they burned like nothing else. I was bruised and scraped from where I'd been thrown around, and though my arm had finally stopped spasming, it was still leaking blood. My mana reserves were almost empty, drained from the night and the hard fight just before. I took a shuddering breath, a couple of tears fighting at the edges of my vision. God, I'd just killed a person, a living, breathing person. I stared at the corpse, questions bouncing about in my head. I didn't think I had the grounds to decide if people deserved death, but if there was anyone in this world who was close, it would have been this woman. I shook my head, turning back to the battle that was wrapping up in the mists behind me. It had only been a couple of minutes since I'd exited that fog, but I was ready to jump back in if I was needed. I could filter this later, tackle whatever it meant for me. Then something impacted me from the side, sending me hurtling into a nearby building. I cracked my head against the wood, which cratered where my body hit. Stars flashed across my vision, the rest of my senses going white. I could just make out somebody strolling out of the fog. I pulled myself out of the cratered wooden wall, then stumbled as pain radiated from my back. I'd probably broken a rib or two. My mind took a few moments to try and process what had just struck me. What happened? What hit me? I started to pull mana from my core, trying to reinforce my body, but I was running dry. The comforting warmth of the energy helped wash away some of my weariness, though. A man was looking down at the corpse of Kaylin Joan, a strange expression on his face. He was stroking his chin, peering at the body like it was a merchant giving him a sour deal. He had sandy blonde hair and was flanked by constructs of solid flame. They looked kind of like cats, though their outlines shifted and blazed as they pawed around the mage. They prowled about, incredibly lifelike. I could sense the fire monoboiling within them. Well, it was only a matter of time before she picked a fight she couldn't win. The man whistled, an imitation of a smile stretching onto his face. His teeth were bright and glistening like fangs poised to bite. Oh, dear sister, I'll tell our brother you tried your best. The man turned to me. Can't forget about you, though, he said, striding forward. His cocky attitude felt familiar somehow, but I couldn't place it. My mind was working at 100 miles an hour, trying to assess this new threat. Could I fight? With my mana so low and my body already wounded, I wasn't sure how much of a struggle I could actually put up. Was escape an option? A flick of my eyes told me that the mist spell was still up. What was taking them so long? You know, Torin, the man said, speaking my name with amused familiarity. Kale really wanted you for herself tonight. She said she'd slit my throat in my sleep if I interfered. He gestured back to the corpse. I didn't interfere. I could practically feel his smile like a physical force. You let your sister die? I asked, thrown for a loop by his statement. This man was one of the Jones? He stopped 10 feet or so from me. You killed her, he said nonchalantly. You were stronger than her. She challenged somebody she shouldn't have. Also, Kale got rid of all of our patrols. The vindictive bitch wanted to fight you alone. She was right about one thing, though. My eyes jumped from his cat-like summons and back to him. They had moved to flank me, slowly creeping in from both sides. You survived the trap we set. I thought you'd burn like a matchstick. Shows what I know. The man's jovial demeanor kept me off balance, but no matter how friendly he was acting, I couldn't let myself be surrounded. So you're going to kill me? Prove yourself stronger somehow by fighting a weakened opponent? The man shook his head. You know something, Torin? He cracked his knuckles, saying my name as if we were old friends. Then he flared his mana. I felt it press against me from all sides, making my breath hitch. He was probably as powerful as his sister had been. I needed to regroup, make it back to the... My planning was cut short as a fist rocketed toward my jaw. I clumsily slipped the punch, trying to shift an attack, but I felt something sharp and hot clamp down on my leg. Looking down, I saw the construct of solid fire sink its teeth into my leg. I screamed as it bit down, sinking jaws into my shin, then pulled me off balance. Another fist came from below, thundering right into my kidney. I crumpled, the pain the final straw on a long list of wear and tear I'd put my body through. No, I thought to myself desperately. Get up, don't let him kill you. The man knelt down, looking at me as I slowly faded in and out of consciousness. My siblings? They like to hide what we are. Wear their masks, whether that be of cloth or courtesy. The Joan looked back at the corpse of his sister. Well, sibling singular. But me? He smiled toothily. I know I'm a monster. It's a shame you'll have to learn that personally. His next punch knocked me from consciousness. Chapter 41. Captured. Published by web novel. Discordant note. TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Elecria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Elecria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Nareni. My dagger cut deeply into the side of the water mage's abdomen, spraying blood and making her scream in fear and pain. Before she could locate me, I slipped back into the mist, letting it obscure my position and hide me from her watching eyes. No, the mage screamed, no small amount of terror in her voice. Her shield of ice was tough. I could only break through it in the weaker links of her armor, but those took time and precision to target. Which was why I was strafing her constantly, jumping in when her back was turned to carve more and more cuts. Most of the other mages had been taken down swiftly by Hoffel and me, but there were a couple of stragglers that held on longer than I would have liked. After Carcian, Wade, and I met up with Hoffel after destroying the warehouses, he told us about our newest member's brash rush to the distillery. It would be nice if Carcian would have actually helped, I thought with irritation. The man had broken off from the group shortly after Hoffel told us about Torrin's stupid idea. I could understand Wade keeping to the sidelines. He wasn't a combat mage. But Torrin should have thought this through. Rushing in alone? Though it seemed his hunch was correct, I thought with a shiver, but not from the cold around me. I'd seen the plume of that explosion from several blocks away. The young striker had been surrounded and getting the beatdown of his life when we'd finally intervened. The implications of that were clear. The Jones were waiting for us. The brown-haired shield waved her wand frantically, calling up another shell of ice. This time it covered her in a dome, keeping her sealed off from the rest of the battle. I huffed in the shadows, spinning my knife in my hand. That would be irritating to break through. I could wait for the woman to collapse from her wounds, but I didn't know if there would be enough time for that. A wall of earth erupted from nearby, rising 10 feet in the air. It was covered in intricate arches and detail, making the otherwise bland slab of rock an artful brick. It rose above the mist, punching through like a spike. Then it began to shift, falling forward toward the dome of ice. Hoffel, you just saved me a lot of time, I thought wryly as the slab of earth impacted the dome. The ice shattered, blown apart by the force of a ton of stone. Not wasting the opening I was given, I funneled more mana through my crest, enhancing my speed and driving me forward. The mist was starting to dissipate. Carson's spell had lasted longer than expected. The water shield turned as I jumped over wayward chunks of ice and stone, weaving with my enhanced sense of balance. Her face was a mask of shock and her arms visibly shook from exhaustion. Before she could respond to my assault, however, my ice-coated fist impacted her temple, causing her to crumple where she stood. I skidded to a halt, turning on my feet to meet Hoffel's gaze. He had a few cuts over his body, but the middle-aged man looked fine. Was that the last of them? I asked him. Pretty sure it was, except for that lightning woman, the man said, fumbling in his pockets for a cigar. He really needed to break that habit. Torrin's probably gonna need our help, though. I remembered the flash of speed and power Torrin had displayed as he rushed the woman cloaked in electricity. In the brief instances I caught sight of his battle before they left the mist, he'd been fighting with a jaw-dropping level of precision and force. The woman had been doing all she could just to hold on. Are you sure about that? I asked, letting my ice weapons dissolve. It looked like he had everything handled. I don't think I've ever seen a mage move so fast. Hoffel lit up his cigar, then moved toward the edge of the mist. I should have kept trying to follow him here, the old shield said, a bit of regret in his tone. Torrin said something was off, and I sensed it too, but I couldn't keep up with him. I followed after at a light jog, conserving what mana I had left. He should have stayed with you. He had his orders, I replied, more than a bit annoyed at our newest member's reckless actions. That was my job. I don't think that explosion was the distillery, though. It couldn't have been, Hoffel replied as we exited the mist. The sight that revealed itself to us made me freeze. There was a body lying in a pool of blood, still in death. From the distance I was at, I couldn't make out much of the corpse except it was clothed all in black. Torrin? I thought with a spike of worry. Had we been too late? But what I noticed next caused my anxiety to ratchet up another notch. No, the body wasn't Torrin's. Those were the remains of the lightning striker. Another man held Torrin's unconscious body slung over his shoulder. It was covered in bruises and blood, and a vivid tattoo of chains wound up along Torrin's left arm. It dangled limply, but a slight rise and fall of his chest told me he was still breathing. Is that why he keeps it covered? A subconscious part of me wondered. To hide the tattoo? I immediately summoned my ice daggers again, getting ready to rush this man. A few beasts made entirely of fire circled him like predators, causing the hairs on the back of my neck to stand on end. You, I called, put the body down, and I might leave your face intact. The man slowly turned to face me, revealing a mop of sandy blonde hair and piercing gray eyes. A leisurely smile adorned his face, which made me feel extremely uneasy. Hoffel moved in beside me, but he didn't raise his weapons. Something was off about the movement. Under Hoffel's mask, his eyes were wide. Flint, he said, surprise in his voice. What are you doing here? The man cocked his head, looking Hoffel up and down. Ah, Hoffel, was it? I remember you. I should have guessed you were with these fools. The way he said the word fools caused me to shift. Hoffel seemed to know the man. Was he an enemy? He was holding Torrin's body, though. The last time I saw you was in the relic tombs, Hoffel said slowly, tightening his grip on his axe and shield. What are you doing here? The cat-like beasts of fire started to fan out after that question. Hoffel finally settled into a combat stance, wary of their attack. Tell me, how's Carcian doing these days? The man asked, ignoring Hoffel's earlier question and stalking to the side. Torrin was still limp on his shoulder. Put down the kid and I might tell you, Hoffel replied. For old ascending partners' sakes. The man snickered. He didn't tell you, did he, about what happened that day? I shifted nervously. I didn't know what Hoffel and the man Flint were talking about, but Torrin was my priority. I couldn't risk attacking while Flint held him, though. I'd have to make an opening somehow. Hoffel went stiff. What do you mean, Flint? The man shook his head. It doesn't matter. When you see that rat again, tell him Dorner Jones sends his regards, he said, turning around with a smile. Or maybe I'll tell him myself when we meet again. Then a form blurred from the alleyway toward Flint. They leveraged a short sword, swinging it at Flint's legs. The man danced backward, surprisingly graceful while carrying the body on one shoulder. A clone coalesced next to Carson's body, launching itself to continue the attack. One of the cat-like fire beasts lunged to intercept, then glowed an ominous orange. It burst apart in an explosion, wiping both it and the clone away in a burst of steam. I'm right here, Dorner, Carcian said, his normal guile in place. And I think you're going to put that boy down and have a nice reunion with me. We can talk about old times. No can do, Cars, Flint said mockingly, another feline of fire shimmering into existence to replace the one he'd lost. I get that you've been dying to meet me again, but I'll get to you eventually. The boss man wants this boy, and you're not part of the deal yet. Carcian didn't exchange another quip, rushing Flint as he threw out his mist spell. Their fight resumed inside the sense-dampening fog. I started to rush forward, intent on helping my teacher. I didn't know much about that Flint man, but I wouldn't let Carcian fight alone. A firm grip on my shoulder stopped me. I turned around, surprised to see Hoffel there. You can't go alone, he said, stepping forward. Flint is dangerous, Nareni, in a way you wouldn't believe. We went on a few ascents together, him, Carcian, and me. He's unpredictable. I nodded, a bit disturbed by Hoffel's seriousness. He was usually laid back, always ready to offer advice or a shoulder to lean on. But now, I could see a spark of the ascender he used to be shining through, scanning over a threat and determining its weaknesses. Before the two of us could step forward, however, a burst of wind blew away the fog. I covered my eyes with my forearm, digging my boots into the ground so I wouldn't be pushed off balance. When the gale died down, Carson's mist had been blown away. Flint was covered in tiny cuts, some of them leaking a bit of blood. Despite the injuries, he was smiling. Torrin was still over his shoulder. Carcian himself stood near the edge of the building, staring harshly at the man. He looked none the worse for wear, but something about Flint made me uneasy. I moved to stand next to my leader. Poison, Cars, really? Flint asked, inspecting one of the cuts on his arm. I expected better than that. It's truly unfortunate, Dorner, but you'll be dead in 15 minutes, Carcian said, but his usual charm was laced with something more angry. I hope you've written your will, dotted your I's and crossed your T's, because you'll be meeting with the High Sovereign soon. Carcian flourished his short sword. I've waited too long for this. If only it was so simple, Flint sighed. You should know a poison that weak won't affect me in the slightest. You should have used something with more kick. Try Hades serpent venom, maybe. I haven't built an immunity to that yet, but while I would love to stay and chat about how you discovered my identity, I'm afraid I'll have to leave you here. You're going to have to wait a bit longer, old pal. You're not going anywhere, I said, tightening my grip on my daggers. If what Carcian said was true, then we'd be able to get Torrin back soon. Flint, who was apparently Dorner Joan, implied he was immune to poison, but he was also running. That couldn't be the full story. The man shook his head, so impatient. If you want a boy to save, then I'll happily provide you with another option. Something bright moved on a nearby rooftop, drawing my eye. I gasped as it revealed itself. One of the feline fire constructs was there, perched on the edge of the rooftop. It held its jaw over the edge, staring down at us emptily. And in its mouth was Wade. He was battered and bruised, and somehow he'd lost his glasses. He was being held by the back of his coat, which somehow wasn't burning from the fiery jaws that held it fast. He was clearly unconscious. My heart shuddered. You'll have to choose one, I heard Flint say, though it was distant. I'm sure you'll make a wise decision, Cars. You always were able to choose the greater good. I took a step toward the building Wade was being dangled over, mana filtering to my crest to help me move. I could catch him if I was fast enough. I could do it. I needed to do it. The creature's grip loosened slightly, causing Wade to slip down a bit. Nah, Flint said, causing my head to snap to him. While I applaud your decision-making skills, young lady, you'll have to wait a minute. The tension rose as I glared at the man. He'd found Wade somehow and hurt him. That alone made a vicious hate gnaw at my insides. I spared a glance at Carcian. I couldn't see under his mask, but there was clear conflict warring in his stance. He wanted to rush Flint and rip out his throat, but that would endanger Wade. I felt the selfish urge to tell Carcian to back off. If he did, maybe Wade would be let free. Flint turned on his heel, Torrin's body still slung over his shoulder. I felt a wave of guilt as I realized I'd subconsciously prioritized Wade over Torrin, but that was quickly consumed by my worry and fear once again. Carcian watched the man go, standing ramrod straight and his teeth gnashing almost audibly. Flint's footsteps sounded dreadfully loud in the quiet night, the soles of his boots echoing on stone. When Flint turned a corner out of sight, I dashed to the side. The fire construct several stories up finally dissipated, its connection to its master weakened by the distance. As the jaws holding Wade quickly dispersed, he began to fall. Come on. I pumped my legs, using all the mana I had left to power my crest. I slid on my knees, conjuring ice under them to allow me to slide better. I held out my arms, catching the young sentry just in time. I skidded into the wall, impacting my shoulder with a grunt, but Wade was safe in my arms. I checked him over with frantic eyes, noting the bruises along his face and body. I didn't know where his glasses had gone. His eyes fluttered slightly. He shifted slightly in my arms. Nareni, he said in a slurred voice. Yeah, I said, feeling a lump in my throat. You're cold, he said, clearly still dazed from being knocked out. Shut up, I replied, hugging him closer. They knew we'd attack, Wade said, slightly slurring his speech. He was waiting for me, same man who went to the meetings. Was the damage worse than I thought? I quickly ran a hand over his head, checking for a bump or something. He pushed my arms away, then tried to stand. I reluctantly let him go, missing the warmth of his body. Dorner Jones somehow figured out he was being spied on. He managed to get his feet under him, though not without some help. They tricked us, he said, his words coming more clearly. His eyes were coming back into focus, though he wouldn't be able to see well without his glasses. They set a trap over here, waiting a bomb to blow. My rats heard about it as I got here, but Torrin tripped the fuse before we all could get close. I put the puzzle pieces together at last. I wouldn't have survived that blast, I said numbly. Only Torrin could have gotten away unscathed. Or maybe Carcian, but by springing the trap early, Torrin might have saved all of our lives. We let him get captured, I said with horror. He was taken away by that Flint. Carcian turned on his feet, glaring at a nearby alleyway. Come out already, he said with restrained calm. I can sense you there, you know. While I indulge in voyeurism every now and then, it's poor form to do it with all your friends involved. Several mages stepped from the shadows. I had been so distracted by Wade's conundrum that I hadn't even noticed their presence, but Carcian had. At their front was an older man, his dark hair streaked with gray. He was slightly short and wore loose-fitting battle robes. In his hand was a staff that swirled with mana, though it looked like a passive effect rather than a charged spell. Behind him was a man in full armor, standing resolutely with a spear held against his shoulder. That one had the easy confidence of a leader, which made me surprised he wasn't in the front. 5 other mages were arrayed behind them, including one who looked incredibly disgruntled. If these people were all combat mages, they had twice our number, and both Hoffel and I were slightly tired from our last fight. Hello, the lead mage said. I assume you're the one they call the rat? Carcian shifted his stance, preparing to face these new men. Were they enemies? Usually, when we were identified, we were attacked first. I have the pleasure of going by that moniker, Carcian replied, bowing slightly. Unfortunately, I don't have yours. The mage looked past Carcian at Hoffel, Wade, and me. My name is Abon, he said. It's probably not relevant to you at all, but I've learned it's always best to introduce yourself when there's a chance of danger. He gestured behind him. My compatriots and I all have a common goal in mind. You're right to think we're dangerous, I said, shifting to stand in front of Wade. The young man looked really confused. It's not you that I fear, Abon replied, looking at me pointedly. But Blood Joan. That took me aback. What? Wade peeked out from my side. Abon the Clearwood guide, he said, peering in the man's general direction. He appeared surprised by Wade calling him out. You know me? Wade squinted. You got the record for most successful expeditions into the Clearwood forest, as well as having a very cheap price to hire. You're kind of famous here. I'd never heard of him, I thought a bit sourly. Wade read too many books. Well, I'm flattered you've heard of me, he said, brushing back his hair. But we've got more important things to discuss. Blood Joan, Carcian said, shifting to stand in front of our group. You want to take them down? Abon shook his head. Not exactly, he said. You see, we owe a debt, he said, gesturing to the men behind him, to Torrin of named Blooddane. For all that I am famous for my expeditions, young mage, I would have perished in that forest if not for the actions of Dusk. He saved my life, the spearman behind Abon said. I was poisoned. He helped me fight it off and get me out of that forest, even though I was only dead weight. I blinked, exchanging a look with Wade, or at least we tried to. It was hard when he couldn't see a foot in front of his face. The point being, company of the rat, Abon said, gesturing to the 5 mages behind him, is that we got here too late. But with a few extra hands. Carcian considered for a moment, then opened his mouth to reply. Chapter 42, Will. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torn Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vritra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torn will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Elecria, and by extension, Torn himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Elecria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torn Dane. My heart pounded in my skull as I slowly came to consciousness, jostled continuously by somebody moving. I squirmed in discomfort, which rewarded me with sharp pain coursing all over my body. I groaned, feeling the bruises and wounds I had all over. My shin, shoulder, and ribs hurt especially. My hands were bound awkwardly behind my back, which stretched out my wounded shoulder in a very unpleasant way. I watched the ground pass by beneath me. I was moving at a slow pace, my eyes taking a moment to adjust to the light. "Ah, awake already, are we?" someone said. Recognizing the voice, my confusion vanished in the face of fear. It was the man who had shown up right after my fight with Kalen Joan. I was slung haphazardly over his shoulder, and